A presidential contest for the first time in more than a decade. 3 contenders united in one purpose: to become Singapore's 9th head of state.
They've been hot on the official campaign trail for 9 days. Different strategies and approaches adopted, all in a bid to win the hearts and minds of voters.
And their efforts all coming down to this: more than 2.7 million people eligible to cast their ballots this polling day. So which way will the votes go? Who will be elected to the highest office in the land?
The answers right here on CNA as the evening unfolds. We'll have the results and reaction as they happen. All these and more on our special coverage of the 2023 Singapore presidential election.
I strongly believe that the time has come in this presidential election to uphold the spirit of the Constitution. The elected presidency is an office that must belong to all Singaporeans.
My whole purpose in life has been to serve Singapore. Respect for all. It is at the heart of our future as Singaporeans.
As President, I will champion the well-being of Singaporeans and always put the people's needs above my own.
Welcome to CNA's results special for the Singapore presidential election. I'm Dawn Tan.
And I'm Oteli Edwards. A warm welcome as well to our viewers on Channel 5, plus those listening in via CNA 938.
Polls closed at thousands of voting stations island-wide at 8 p.m. sharp. At the last update of voter turnout at 5 p.m, about 85% of the more than 2.7 million eligible Singaporeans had already cast their ballots. Now, the mood was jubilant at Wisma Geylang Serai as the polling station closed.
1-0, polling station closed.
And at a polling station in Jurong East, here are officials as they sealed the boxes containing the marked ballot papers. Candidates and their polling agents may witness the process and even place their own seals on them. The sealed ballot boxes will then be taken to 215 counting centres across Singapore.
And these are the 3 contenders for the presidency. A former GIC Chief Investment Officer, Mr. Kok Song. Former Senior Minister, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. And former NTUC Income Chief Executive, Mr. Kin Lian. By the end of the night, we'll know which of these 3 men will be Singapore's next head of state. Let's take a closer look now at each of the presidential contenders. First, Mr. Kok Song. The 75-year-old is the Executive Chairman of Avanda Investment Management. He was formerly Chief Investment Officer at GIC. Mr. Ng's campaign slogan is United for Our Future. Then there is Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. The 66-year-old former senior minister has more than 20 years of experience in politics. Mr. Tharman has said he wants to serve as a president for a new and more challenging era. And his campaign slogan is Respect for All. On now to Mr. Kin Lian. The former NTUC Income CEO wants to play an active role as president to improve the lives of Singaporeans. It's the 75-year-old's second presidential bid. His campaign slogan is Bring Back Trust, Give Us Hope. Well, you'll be seeing more of this graphic through the night as we discuss the candidates and the hot button issues that arose during campaigning. And plenty of developments expected as the night progresses. Our cameras and our reporters are our eyes and ears on the ground.
I'm Rebecca Mateo. I'm here at the social media agency where presidential candidate Mr. Kok Song and some of his family members will be as they await the results of the presidential poll.
I'm Tan Sihui, and I'll be trailing Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam and his team, and I'll be here with his supporters at his former stomping ground, Taman Jurong.
I'm Alif Amshar, and I'm here at Mr. Tan Kin Lian's residence where he and his team will await the results tonight.
I'm Geraldine Yap, reporting from the Elections Department. This is the principal counting centre for the presidential election, and it's where results from across the island will be tallied. It's also where the returning officer will announce who has been elected as Singapore's 9th president.
Well, live first to Rebecca Mateo. She's been trailing presidential candidate Mr. Kok Song. Rebecca, a big night for this 75-year-old man. What's happening right now?
Now, Dawn, this is a gathering spot for friends and families. It's not open to the public, and we can expect some of his brothers, his children, and some of a group of volunteers to be here later as well. There should be about 30 of them here. Now, earlier on, I already saw his brother, as well as some of his assenters, and his seconder, Dr. Carol Tan, who was here. They're all here now in a room. They're watching the live reports as well. And they came here dressed light because they know that they'll be staying here throughout the night. And Mr. Kok Song and his fiancée, Sibyl Lau, will only be here after the sample count is in, and we are expecting Mr. to be speak to the media after the final results are out. Now, as you can see, the space around me is a rather cozy and a small space, and there aren't much decorations related to the presidential election, but you can see there are 3 campaign posters by 3 of Mr. Kok Song's campaign posters. Now, they have also set aside several TVs all around this place for people to watch the live reports. And they've also set up a media room for us to work, for a bunch of the reporters who are here to do some of their work. And what's important is that this place is also the informal campaign headquarters for Mr. Now, this is a place where Mr. and his team come together to discuss the campaign strategy and amend some of his speeches. Now, the team has also provided us food and drinks just to last us through the night. You know, I saw the food kept coming in. They also prepared us booster jellies just to keep us, power us through the night. Back to the
Thanks for that, Rebecca. On now to Tan Sihui, who's been tracking Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Sihui, fill us in. What do you have for us?
Now, supporters are slowly trickling in. Now, I've spoken to some of the residents who live around here in Taman Jurong, and they say that this coffee shop is normally the place that people come here to support Mr. Tharman during major elections. And so the presidential elections is no exception. And so we've seen some supporters wearing maroon shirts. We also could be expecting some people wearing the pineapple symbol, and that's because he's chosen the fruit as his symbol. That's because the fruit is a symbol of good things to come, and because in the Hokkien dialect it's called Ong Lai, and so it's prosperity and good luck, a welcoming symbol. And so I spoke to one of the supporters. He said he's been here since 6:30 p.m. of course to have dinner and also to attend a watch party right behind me, and there are 2 screens on inside the coffee shop, and he told me actually during the pandemic it was totally shut off, but they requested that they want to watch the results show, in fact this show right now, and so they are anxiously waiting for the results. Now, it comes as no surprise that the supporters are here in Taman Jurong because in the last 22 years he was an MP here at Jurong GRC, and he also began his career, and just a while ago he had a farewell event before he stepped down as senior minister, and throngs of supporters went to say their farewells to him because they were going to wish him good luck for the highest office of the land. But right now we won't be seeing Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam as he is watching and awaiting results at home.
All right, thank you, Sihui. Well, CNA's Alif Amshar has been tracking Mr. Tan Kin Lian. What's the buzz where you are, Alif?
Well, Dawn, not quite the buzz here at Mr. Tan Kin Lian's residence, where he and his team will await the results tonight. Mr. Tan Kin Lian is currently not at home. He has left to a counting centre where he will oversee the proceedings there. Currently, Mr. Tan has also opened up his front porch, his garden, to allow members of the media to wait for the night's proceedings. We've been sitting there for about an hour now for some of the early birds. Mr. Tan even came out to speak to us, to ask how we are doing. He appears very calm, very confident. He didn't say much about today's proceedings, but really shared about his experience running the campaign for this election. Now, members of the media also waiting outside Mr. Tan's residence tonight. And of course, Mr. Tan is no stranger to these proceedings, having contested in the 2011 presidential polls. And at that time, he went up against 3 other contenders, eventually losing to former President Dr. Tony Tan, Dr. Tan Cheng Bock, and then Mr. Tan Jee Seer as well. In that election, Mr. Tan Kin Lian finished 4th out of 4 candidates. He garnered less than 5% of the votes, 4.9% to be exact, and therefore, as a result, he also lost his election deposit of 48,000 Singapore dollars. So whether this time round the stars will align for Mr. Tan, we'll have to wait and see when we get greater clarity on how the results or the votes have gone.
Thanks, Alif, for that. Let's go over to Geraldine Yap at the Elections Department. Jerry, you've been tracking this vote counting process. How's that coming along?
Well, so of course, vote counting is currently underway, or it should be starting soon if it hasn't already started. And this is taking place at the 215 counting centres that are located across the island. Now, here where I'm at the Elections Department, this is the principal counting centre. And so this is where the numbers from all of the counting centres will be tallied, and we will get the final results. So for a rough timeline for tonight, we are expecting to see the sample counts come in somewhere between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. and that should give us an early indication of the possible outcome of this election. But of course, the sample count is just a sample and it's not the final result. So, as for the final result, we might have to wait till midnight to find out who has won the election, and that's if there is no recount in the election. But of course, if there is a margin of 2% or less between 2 of the candidates, then there will be a recount, and the results will come in much later after midnight. Now, we know that for this election there is also overseas voting, and some 6,600 Singaporeans living overseas have signed up to vote either by mail or to vote at one of the 10 overseas polling stations. So counting of those votes will only take place 10 days after polling day, which means that we will still have to wait to find out the final vote count that each of the candidates has achieved.
Meanwhile, counting here tonight continues. Geraldine, thank you very much. We've also got someone with us to discuss all the developments. Eugene Tan is Associate Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University. He's also a political commentator and former nominated Member of Parliament. Eugene was here with us on nomination day, and he is back in the studio to take us through all the developments of polling day. Eugene, welcome. It's good to see you.
No, thank you for having me.
So what did you see as the top 3 issues that emerged during the 9-day campaign period?
I think the top issue was this issue relating to the independence of the 3 presidential candidates, right? The question of whether they would be able to exercise the custodial powers of the president without fear of favour. And this goes then to the question of their past affiliations, right? Whether to the ruling political party, the People's Action Party, the establishment, such as GIC. But it also interrogated current affiliations, right? So we saw that for Mr. Tan Kin Lian, when opposition figures like Dr. Tan Cheng Bock, Dr. Chee Soon Juan, Mr. Kenneth Jeyaretnam, Mr. Lim Tian, all endorsing Mr. Tan Kin Lian, albeit in a personal capacity. So this is an issue that has really come to the fore, and we'll see how voters have responded to that. Whether voters are just going to rely on prior affiliations, to make up their minds, or are they going to go beyond that, to determine whether, based on what they see of a candidate's track record, whether that candidate can rise above previous affiliations. The second issue for me would be this question of experience and ability, right? So it goes to the question of the merit of each candidate. How are they equipped to do the job? Does their previous experience, whether in the private sector or in GIC or in government, how well has that prepared them, for the multifaceted roles that the president play, not just in exercising the custodial powers, but also in the community and ceremonial functions, that the president is expected, to play. And so one of it is, of course, the international stature, right? How would each of these candidates profile Singapore on the world stage, right? When the president goes on state visits, what if the president were to engage at high-level discussions? I think that's something, that is very important to a small state like Singapore, very dependent on trade, very dependent on being open to the world. I think the third issue relates to, this whole issue of, what exactly is the presidency there for? And I think we saw competing, even conflicting visions of what the presidency is, right? Each candidate, would have a different take, and that raises questions of whether the candidates were accurate, whether they have faithfully interpreted the Constitution as to the role of the president. So I think there were a lot of issues, but that for candidates to put forth, to the voters to win their hearts and minds. And of course, there were other issues, right? How was the campaign conducted, the campaigning styles and all. But to me, I think these were the three key issues.
Well, we will be diving a lot deeper into all of those issues and lots more as the night progresses, Eugene. But thank you for that. Well, voting for Singapore's 9th president has come to an end. For this election, some 2.7 million Singaporeans were eligible to vote. And this is about 55,000 more than the number who were eligible in the 2020 general elections. And by 5 p.m. today, 85% of those eligible had cast their ballot.
The doors to polling stations are shut, and with candidates and their polling agents witnessing, ballot boxes were sealed by election officials. Then, under police escort, the boxes from all 1,264 stations were transported to counting centres. A sample count is expected to be released before 11 p.m. The Elections Department says the sample count helps prevent speculation and misinformation from unofficial sources while counting is underway. And for now, Sabrina Ng brings us more on what happened earlier today.
Scenes like these were played out all across the country this morning. Some voters began queuing at 7:30 a.m. before polling stations opened. For first-time voters, it was an exciting time.
Being able to be politically involved and playing your part as a citizen in terms of choosing wisely and choosing who you want as your leader to represent your nation on a global scale is something that I do take pride in.
Singapore's leaders were spotted at the polling stations. President Halimah Yacob and her husband were among the first to cast their ballots at Chung Cheng High School Main. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and his wife were also early, casting their ballots at Crescent Girls' School. Some used the Election Department's website to check the queue status at their polling stations before heading down. There were also priority queues for seniors and those with special needs. Voters registered electronically, proceeded to collect their ballot papers, then cast their vote.
The process is quite fast. The moment you went in, just like a smooth flow, you can straight away go to the balloting queue and just do your vote and then just submit it in.
But about half an hour after the polls opened, queues started to build up at some stations. Some had technical issues with the e-registration system. At around 10 this morning, ELD said queues had improved at most polling stations and told voters to head to the polls throughout the day.
Very fast because afternoon nobody. First we thought morning and to come, but afternoon better.
By noon, slightly more than half of all eligible voters had finished voting. The three men contesting for the presidency also cast their votes. Mr. Tan Kin Lian was the first of the three, voting at Anderson Serangoon Junior College.
It was very smooth, so I think I must have waited maybe just 2 minutes. So it's very. Of course, I was in the priority queue.
Mr. Kok Song voted at Katong Community Centre.
Very nice today. Bright and breezy. Had a good night's sleep. So thank you for all coming. I'll go in and vote now.
Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam voted in the evening at Raffles Girls Primary School.
I'm feeling fine. I'm feeling it feels good. Just the calmness of Singapore feels good.
And for the first time, more than 4,000 Singaporeans voted at special polling stations set up in nursing homes.
For bedbound residents who otherwise have problems getting out of the home, now they are given the opportunity to vote.
By 3 p.m., about 2 million Singaporeans, or 74% of eligible voters, had made their choice. Queues had eased at most places by then. At 5 p.m., just 3 hours to the close of voting, around 85% had voted. And finally, at 8 p.m., after the last ballots were cast, the doors to polling stations around Singapore were shut. And the wait begins as ballots are counted.
We are waiting for the Elections Department to release the sample count for the presidential poll. Well, the sample count is taken from a random pool of ballot papers to give an early indication of the possible election outcome. It's to prevent speculation and misinformation while counting is underway, and also to serve as a check against the final results. The sample count is carried out when vote counting begins. 100 ballot papers are chosen at random from each polling station in front of the candidates and counting agents if they're present. Now, the votes for each candidate are then counted. They are then added with weightage given to account for the difference in the number of votes cast at each polling station. The sample count will be shown as a percentage of valid votes garnered by each candidate. Well, this normally differs from the actual result by error margins that range between 1% and up to 5%, according to the math behind this. This is the very first presidential poll in which the sample count will be publicly released. The move was taken in the past 2 general elections. In GE 2015, the first sample count was released less than 2 hours after voting closed. But ultimately, the sample count for this poll is just a glimpse into who could be Singapore's next president. If the numbers are too close to call, we'll need to wait for counting to be completed and the returning officer to make the formal announcement.
Without fear or favour, whoever is elected president will speak these words when they take their oath of office. Over the week of campaigning, the candidates spelled out their definitions of what being independent means.
I'm independent-minded. I've always sought to find a consensus with my colleagues on the direction of change and the policy changes required.
I am participating in the upcoming election to give the people of Singapore a chance to vote for a president that is independent of the ruling government.
One candidate, People's Action Party. Another candidate, Opposition Party. I'm the third candidate, no party.
The debate intensified at a walkabout in Chinatown last Sunday. Mr. Tan Kin Lian appeared with 2 prominent members of opposition parties, Mr. Tan Cheng Bock and Mr. Tan Ji Se. Remarkably, all 3 stood against each other in the 2011 presidential election. Now, during the press conference, they endorsed the Tan running again for the office. Mr. Tan Kin Lian also hinted at appointing them to the Council of Presidential Advisors. Material seen at the event suggested a vote for Mr. Tan would equate to a vote for 3 presidents.
They will share the same vision of an effective, independent president. They will be excellent candidates into the council. I have not asked for I have not asked them this question yet.
Mr. Kok Song said that such endorsements make people confuse the presidential poll with a general election.
There's a danger that he's going to be manipulated by those leaders of the opposition parties. They even went so far as to say that those who are supporting him may be appointed as advisors to the Council of Presidential Advisors.
During CNA's presidential forum, all three candidates agreed the election for Singapore's highest office should not be politicized. But Mr. Tharman also said labels based on past party affiliation is extremely simplistic. And this would have ruled out past candidates and even senior civil servants or private sector individuals.
Let's say you have a private company, you have a construction company that depends on government contracts, or you have a fund management company that depends on government monies. Does that make you not independent? Not necessarily. It depends on your character, your track record.
Well, in response, Mr. Kok Song said that Mr. Tharman took the point too far. He's also urged Singaporeans to consider if an ex-minister can check his own policies.
I do not believe any person should be put in such a position of conflict. And we don't need to. We cannot rely on an own-self check, own-self mechanism to safeguard our reserves or the integrity of the public service.
Well, let's get back to Professor Eugene Tan, who is in the studio with us for more on this. Eugene, under the Singapore Constitution, the elected president must be and must be seen to be politically neutral. In your opinion, should political parties be endorsing the president openly in this way, even though you mentioned in the beginning that some of these individuals might be doing it in their personal capacity, but the role is supposed to be apolitical. Is it a legal issue? Is it an ethical issue? Should we be concerned?
Well, the laws are silent, as to whether political parties and politicians should endorse presidential election candidates. But if we look at the nature of the office, right, it is supposed to be a unifying institution. It is supposed to be above the political fray. It is not an independent center of power. I think it stands to reason that politicians and political parties should not get involved in the election process, particularly in terms of trying to endorse any particular candidate. Certainly, if we go back, to the first presidential election in 1993, Mr. Ong Teng Cheong, one of the two candidates, was openly endorsed, by the ruling People's Action Party. But subsequently, in future elections, the ruling party did not endorse any candidate. While it may be clear, which candidate may be preferred, but I think it is important, that the ruling party did not go out openly to endorse, and we see that right in this current election as well. I think when you have political parties and politicians endorsing, right, it raises questions about whether that particular candidate, would be independent, right? And in a way, Mr. Tan put the issue very graphically, right? When he said, well, if you vote for me and I do get elected, there'll be three presidents, right? Because Mr. Tan Jee Se and Dr. Tan Cheng Bock, active politicians, will be on the Council of Presidential Advisors, right? So effectively, right, you are making the presidency, in that manner, a politicized institution, and that will undercut, any ability of the president, of the presidency, to be unifying figure and institution. And I think that'll be sad, right? Because, we can have contested politics and all, and we do that by way of parliament and through the general elections. But I think it's useful to have an office, and the head of state would be an ideal one, where the president can unite Singaporeans, right, regardless of their race, their language, their religion, as well as the political affiliation, right? Because if we have institutions which are seen as prizes to be captured by different political parties, then I think, these institutions, will never be able, to go about the duties for which, they are required to do.
And Eugene, you've mentioned some of these issues coming to the fore, like independence and all the past affiliation. And candidates were using all these various platforms to counter some of these accusations. Did you feel that any of the responses basically crossed the line, perhaps into heated territory?
I think for me, the biggest concern was when we had visions of the presidency, which are not supported by the Constitution. I suppose, as someone who teaches constitutional law, I would say I'm familiar, right? And I do think that, when candidates put forth a vision of the presidency that doesn't exist under the Constitution, that to me would amount to a misrepresentation, right? Because the president would never, right, be able to carry out any of those promises, right? Because the president doesn't have the power, right? So if we look at the presidency, right, it does not have independent policy making or lawmaking power. I have often described the presidency as a reactionary institution with regard to the use of the custodial powers, right? So if the government decides to draw down on past reserves, or to make a key appointment, then the president's powers are triggered, But otherwise, the president cannot say, oh, I would like the government to consider person A, to be a key appointment holder, let's say the Chief Justice, right? Neither can the president initiate, policy to draw down on past reserves. So I do think that, there have been some confusion, in the course of the campaign.
I think it does beg the question, though, Eugene, as to why Mr. Tan Kin Lian would choose to actually surround himself in that manner, because he clearly knows what the parameters are for what the president can and cannot do. So perhaps there's something to do with optics involved as well?
Well, I think it's one way in which he sought to profile his campaign, right? So if you contrast that, for example, with Mr. Tharman, Mr. Tharman, kept studiously, to the powers, roles, and functions of the presidency. He never got a single thing wrong. And so his campaign might seem somewhat laid back, right? Because he could be seen by some voters as representing the status quo. But I would say that he kept faithfully to what the president's office is. And I suppose for Mr. Tan, it was a way in which to energize his campaign, right, which had been flagging, right. If you recall, it started with being mired in significant controversy, right? And on Sunday, what I would like to call Super Sunday, right, which was the only weekend in this presidential election campaign, the fact that you had Dr. Tan Cheng Bock and coming out to campaign and endorsing Mr. Tan Kin Lian, that sort of got people excited as well. But I think it gives the impression that this is an institution that parties should try to capture, right? And so if you're not in favor of if Parliament is dominated by one party, then perhaps the presidency should go to another party. But that undercuts what the presidency is all about.
All right.
All right, we'll be keeping the conversations going, but for now, we are going to go for a short break. Don't go away as we keep a close eye on the outcome of the Singapore presidential election.
Welcome back to CNA's results special for Singapore's presidential election. Ballot boxes have started to arrive at counting centres island-wide.
At this counting centre, boxes began arriving half an hour after voting closed, while officials opened the sealed ballot boxes in the presence of candidates' polling agents. They poured the ballot papers out and jumbled them up. When collated, the slips will be tallied with these mechanical counting machines. Introduced during the 2020 general election, they will be used at all 215 counting centres. The sample count will be done at the start of the process to give Singaporeans a glimpse of the possible outcome.
Well, many Singaporeans in mainland China and Hong Kong had to wrestle rough weather and logistical challenges to get their votes in for the presidential election. Olivia Seong reports from Beijing.
I'm going to cast my vote for the next presidential election by post.
33-year-old Christy Liu has been living in China's Yangjiang for about a year. With no polling station where she is and the nearest one 3 hours away in Hong Kong, she quickly registered to send in her ballot by post, but little did she expect to run into numerous obstacles.
新加坡的境外的监区到市区那边寄的，这边寄不了。
That sent Ms. Liu on a 21-kilometre drive the next day, although new challenges emerged. Ms. Liu said the post office staff told her they were unfamiliar with how to handle the return envelope, and in the end, she had to pay about $3 Singapore for registered mail to get her ballot sent back.
More than happy to pay because I wanted the vote to be counted for sure. But I thought the whole process maybe could be better because I'm not sure about other countries, but probably mainly in China. Language is also a barrier.
Some other voters in China also told CNA of similar experiences, while others said they simply dropped their vote in the mailbox. A few raised concerns over whether their vote would reach Singapore and before September 11, the stipulated deadline. Singapore's elections department said those who downloaded their ballots would be considered as having tried to vote, and their names will not be removed from the registers of electors even if their ballot is not received. Those whose ballots have been received will be informed via email after the counting of overseas votes is complete. On hindsight, 45-year-old Jason Lim says he wished he had opted for the postal ballot. The Singaporean who lives in Guangzhou had taken a day off work, intending to go to nearby Hong Kong to cast his vote. But these plans were swept aside as a super typhoon hurled towards China's south. The high-speed rail train that Mr. Lim was booked on to Hong Kong cancelled as a result.
I was so disappointed and I was thinking, is there any other way I can do? I tried to. I even thought of flying back to Singapore to vote, but you know I suppose because of the typhoon, even airplane is unable to fly.
The Singapore Consulate General announced on Friday morning that voting would proceed in the city, even though the third highest typhoon warning was issued in the early hours of Friday. It added that registered voters who decide not to cast their ballot for safety reasons can reach out to the Elections Department to restore their names to the registers of electors. Over at the Singapore Embassy in Beijing, voters told CNA that the process was quick and smooth.
I'm actually working in Tianjin, so I thought it's important for us to come in person, like, to physically put a vote in.
My second time actually, and I think it's important because we have a voice even though we're not in Singapore.
More than 6,600 Singaporeans registered as overseas voters for this year's presidential election. About a quarter, or 1,600, live in mainland China, Taiwan and Hong Kong. Now, at the close of voting, the ballot box will then be sealed and immediately sent back to Singapore, where on arrival, it will be stored at the Supreme Court until counting is done. Olivia Seong, CNA, Beijing.
The Singaporeans in Tokyo also braved the elements to cast the ballot. The Japanese capital is experiencing a heat wave and is one of 10 overseas polling stations for this election. Michio Ishida tells us more.
Desmond Teo and his wife Angie Chan were so determined to vote this time round. Despite their busy schedules, they decided to work in a cafe near the Singapore Embassy so they can quickly cast their ballots. It's their second time casting their ballots in Tokyo.
We understand the importance of electing our president, so I think this is just us doing our part, right, for our country. Yeah, even though we are away from Singapore.
Polling takes place at a time Tokyo continues to experience a heat wave, hitting close to 35 degrees Celsius. It's the hottest summer ever for the Japanese capital since temperatures were recorded from 1898.
Under this heat.
Yeah, it's really hot today.
How are you coping under this heat wave?
Well, we have been staying at home a lot with air conditioning.
While many were happy to vote and fulfill their duty as Singaporeans, but they complained it was just too hot.
I try to go to the office earlier in the day and leave later in the evening, so I'm not out in the sun as much. Yeah.
As you can see, I'm sweating all the time. Yeah, it's like a lot of people tell me oh, you're from Singapore, you should be used to the heat, but actually it's not true. We are not as hot there as it is here.
This is the worst summer I ever experienced in Japan.
As much as it was important to meet the setup required by the election department in Singapore, embassy staff prepared to accommodate electorates considering the heat wave risk.
What we have done is the polling station is located within the embassy, which is air-conditioned, and there's lots of shade in the vicinity. We've also standby bottles of water for members of the public who may need it, and our embassy staff are on hand to assist any voters who may feel discomfort, especially due to the heat.
The number of Singaporeans in Japan has remained stable over the past 3 years. As of December 2022, 3,036 Singaporeans resided in Japan, according to the Japanese government statistics. About half of them live in Tokyo. So there are quite a few who have had to travel for this election. And there are those I contacted who could not vote. They were unable to be in Singapore for 30 days during the past 3 years, primarily due to COVID-19 traveling restrictions. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
A key function of the president is holding the second key to unlocking Singapore's reserves. Each candidate has also talked about how they would approach the matter.
As a former finance minister and deputy prime minister, Mr. Tharman says he has real experience with how reserves should be used. That is, in unpredictable situations with no end in sight, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which the government drew 40 billion Singapore dollars from past reserves.
There's a lot that's unpredictable about climate change as well. And we've got to make sure that Singapore is well prepared, and it will need some infrastructure. We might decide to borrow in order to invest in it. We may decide to boost domestic resources. But we may also have to think hard about some use of reserves.
Mr. Kok Song said that during his time as GIC's chief investment officer, he steered the Sovereign Wealth Fund through many complex economic situations. He listed some questions he would ask the government if it wanted to spend Singapore's reserves during a crisis.
What is the total size of our reserves? How much are you asking to spend out of the reserves? What are the assumptions that the government is making regarding the crisis? Is it an international crisis, a domestic crisis? How long do you expect the crisis to last? Another question which I would ask is, have you exhausted the possibility of raising revenues from other areas before asking me, the President, for permission to draw on the past reserves?
Taking a different tack, Mr. Kin Lian has asked if the country is saving too much when it could be spending on current generations. He's also questioned how the reserves were used during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Is it spent unwisely or is it spent wisely? For example, our biggest use of past reserves was during the COVID. A large sum of money was set aside. And there was some part of the money that went into banks that were making huge profits, and they were given subsidy by the government. I consider that to be not suitable use of the reserves.
So, Eugene, we've heard there from the CNA Presidential Forum, there was a lot of talk about experience and competence with regards to the reserves, and some have highlighted, their roles working directly with the reserves. But really, how much of this is necessary, noting the experience of previous presidents?
I think it's important, for a president, to be able to have a sense of what's happening globally, right? And what is it that is needed for Singapore to deal with, let's say, a crisis, right? Whether it's a pandemic or climate change. Because you need to ask the right questions. You need to be able to push the government to make a case to justify the drawdown of past reserves. The reserves are significant, right? And I think we should be clear that the president of the day will have a sense of how much reserves we have. And of course, there's been this call, to make the figure known to the public. But if we come back to the question of whether, experience and ability, I think it is important. It is important because the temptation to dip into the cookie jar is always there, right? Because for a government of the day, in order to fund expensive projects, maybe even unnecessary project, extravagant spending, to win votes, all that is certainly possible. Now, governments can do that, right? But they have to use reserves that they have accumulated during their current term of government. But the moment they want to touch the reserves, there must be a good reason. And I suppose, it reflects very much how we in our individual households would also approach our savings, right? We will not draw down our savings unnecessarily because we do think that they serve a useful purpose. And I think it is important that we do not get into the habit, for the slightest reason, to draw down on past reserves, right? It is easy to draw down, but much harder, to build up the reserves. And I'm not sure, in the end, it is right to say that we could be saving too much. As it is, our past reserves contribute about 50% of the government's revenue in every financial year's budget. That's significant, right? Previously, only 40% went to the budget, 60% were locked away. But because of the increased spending needs, the Constitution was amended, to allow for a 50-50 share. So which means 50% of the investment returns from past reserves go to the government's current year's budget, 50% will be locked away. And I think that's important, right? Because we do want Singapore to be able to continue, right? We don't want to leave a Singapore that is impoverished. Because if that's the case, then why are we here in the first place? So I would say that, while you don't need special ability, I think candidates that have experience in dealing with the reserves, I think that puts them at some advantage, right? Because they know the system well, they will to know what sort of questions to ask, they will be able to push the government, to make a better justification if there isn't one already. So I would say that it is critical.
And so the ability to ask the right questions is important. But the cookies in that cookie jar, as you framed it, Eugene, some candidates have articulated a wish to be able to have some say over it, on how much can be drawn in the event that there is a crisis, as an example, what the reserves can and cannot be used for. That's what they've articulated during this campaign period. They've even made assumptions on how revenue is calculated, as an example. Can the president even do any of that? And if he or she can, to what extent?
Well, again, right, the president is the custodian, right? So he is what I would call, he provides the shield for the reserves. Anyone who wants to use the past reserves, they have to get the second key from him, right? And another metaphor is really he provides the shield. And so it becomes critical, where the president is concerned, that his role is that of a defender, right? He doesn't initiate policies on drawing down the reserves. He doesn't go and tell our sovereign wealth funds, the GIC and Temasek, that perhaps, you should invest in this, you should invest in that. He can certainly, in private conversations with the government, confidential discussions, put across his view, right? But in the end, right, the question really is, does the president have domain expertise in that particular area, right? His primary role, where it comes to the reserves, right, is to decide whether a planned drawdown of past reserves is justified. Beyond that, it depends on his working relationship with the government. But we must bear in mind, the use of past reserves is really at the initiative and direction of the government, right? The president holds the second key. He protects the past reserves, but he is not an investment manager, right? He doesn't go about telling the government how to invest. So I think that much needs to be clear.
I think there's also quite a bit of, chatter about knowing the exact amount of reserves. And at least one person, I think Kok Song, has said that, that's a good thing to know. But is it something that is necessary?
I would say that the president definitely would know the extent, of our past reserves, right? Because if he's going to defend our past reserves, he needs to know how much there is in the first place. But I think, the question of whether past reserves should be made public, for a broader consumption. And I think that's where we have to be very careful. Because if, for example, a foreign entity, a country, right, with ill intent, decides to attack the Singapore dollar, if the attacker knows how much we have and to what extent, we are able to protect the currency, that could give the attacker a good indication of whether they want to engage in this battle. But if the attacker doesn't know how much we have, then I think, the attacker could be putting itself at risk, right? Because if they are not able to win that speculative attack on the Singapore dollar, they will suffer a lot more. It's very much the same way as, if we think about, the country's defense, right? If you know how many fighter jets we have or how many tanks we have, and in a warfare, they know how many have been destroyed, that could then result in the enemy gaining, an advantage over us. So I think, in many respects, it doesn't matter, to my mind, whether the ordinary Singaporean knows how much reserves we have, because I think it'll be quite meaningless. So what if we say that we have 1 trillion, right? And of course, to the typical Singaporean, that is a lot of money, right? But if we think about what the money needs to be used for, to tide over difficult circumstances, I think that is where, the typical Singaporean may not be able to make those sort of assessments. So I volunteer at a charity that runs 3 nursing homes. And we do have our own reserves policy. So for example, we may spend, let's say, our expenses annually will be $10 to $15 million. And we work on the premise that if we are not able to raise funds, or we're not able to get government grants, how long can we sustain ourselves, without any inflow of funds? So this inflow of this knowledge, that you have these reserves, puts you in a better position to plan ahead, to be able to deal with unforeseen circumstances, but also to gear you to be able to defend yourself against other entities who may have ill intent towards Singapore.
All right, thank you, Eugene. Well, we are going to go for a short break right now, but don't go away. We are going to keep a close eye on the outcome of the Singapore presidential elections, so stay with us. Welcome back to CNA's special coverage of Singapore's presidential election. Polls closed 2 hours ago and vote counting is firmly underway. Ballot boxes arriving at counting centres all over the island. At this counting centre, boxes began arriving half an hour after voting closed. Officials opened the sealed ballot boxes in the presence of candidates' polling agents. They poured the ballot papers out and jumbled them up. When collated, the slips will be tallied with these mechanical counting machines. Introduced during the 2020 general election, they will be used at all 215 counting centres.
And these are the three men who are running for the presidency. First, Mr. Kok Song. The 75-year-old is the executive chairman of Vanda Investment Management. He was formerly chief investment officer at GIC. Mr. Ng's campaign slogan is United for Our Future. Then there is Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. The 66-year-old former senior minister has more than 20 years of experience in politics. Mr. Tharman has said he wants to serve as a president for a new and more challenging era. And his campaign slogan is Respect for All. On now to Mr. Kin Lian. The former NTUC Income CEO wants to play an active role as president to improve the lives of Singaporeans. It's the 75-year-old's second presidential bid, and his campaign slogan is Bring Back Trust, Give Us Hope. Well, you'll be seeing more of this graphic through the night as we discuss the candidates and the hot-button issues that arose during campaigning. And our camera crew and reporters busy on the ground as they track the presidential candidates as well as the vote counting process. Well, live first to Rebecca Mateo. She's been trailing presidential candidate Mr. Kok Song. Rebecca, what is it like where you are now?
Now, Otalia, I'm Rebecca Mateo. I'm here at the social media agency where presidential candidate Mr. Kok Song and his family members will be here later as they await the results of the presidential polls. And now this is a gathering spot for friends and families. They will be here later, and we are expecting some of his brothers and supporters, as well as some of the volunteers, a group of volunteers who will be here, and his friends. And we are expecting about a total of 30 people here. And now earlier on, I saw his brother, some assenters, and his seconder, Dr. Carol Tan, who came earlier. Now, they're all seated in that room over there where they'll be able to watch the report of the presidential polls. Now, there's another space here where supporters, friends, and families can also watch the live report of the presidential poll. And this is a space here. They have a television there. And as you can see, this space is pretty small and cozy. There isn't much materials about the presidential election, but we can see three of Mr. Kok Song's campaign posters. Now, but this place is a special place because it is an informal campaign headquarters for Mr. Ng. Now, this is also the place where Mr. Ng and his team come to discuss their campaign strategy and also where Mr. Ng review his speeches. Now, we can expect Mr. Kok Song to come in anytime soon as he and his fiancée Sybil Lau will be here after the sample count is in. Now, Mr. Ng will not be speaking to the media just yet, but he will be speaking to the media after the results are in. Now, that's all I have for now. Back to the studio.
Rebecca, thank you, Rebecca Mateo there. Live now to Tan Se Hui, who's been tracking Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. So, what's the latest development?
Hundreds of supporters have arrived, and in fact, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam himself has arrived, and there are many supporters here. Now, let's have a look, and we'll try to have a word with him. Now, his supporters are all dressed in maroon. Some of them we heard earlier saying "Huat with the pineapples. That's his symbol of his campaign. Now he's making his way to meet his supporters. This is Tamang Jurong Hawker Centre. There are many supporters that have turned up, and that is no surprise, and that's because 22 years he was an MP at Jurong GRC. Now he's trying to make his way through, and it looks like people are cheering for him on the second floor. In fact, all of the levels at Taman Jurong Hawker Centre are filled if you look out there. Mr. Tharman, we are live on CNE at the moment. How are you feeling at the moment?
We'll do that later, thanks.
He will be speaking to us later, but as we know right now, he is going to shake the hands of many of his supporters. Just a while back, before he stepped aside and stepped down as senior minister, he was also at Taman Jurong, and hundreds like this, they turned up to say goodbye and also to wish him well for the highest office of the land. And it seems that this is the same kind of emotion right there. Now look at that right there. All the way up there, there are supporters ahead in front, and they're all over surrounding the hawker centre. As we know, online, that is the Hokkien dialect for pineapple. Now he's heading up the escalator. People are happily cheering for him. And clearly the symbol of the pineapple has resonated with people. And we've seen him on the campaign trail. People passing to him pineapples, pineapple tarts. Let's see if we can try to go up on the escalator. Now, Mr. Tharman, he started his campaign and he revealed his slogan as respect for all, and that means respect for people of different jobs, different skills, whether you're young or old, whether your education attainment, it doesn't matter. He says that that will be his immediate priority if he gets elected as president. Now let's take a look at the second floor. Now watch your step. Now he's right there with supporters. What I can see is people from all walks of life. They are here to support him. Different races, different backgrounds. Even young children, the parents say that they don't want to sleep. They want to see Mr. Tharman.
Well, quite the atmosphere there at Taman Jurong Food Centre. Thanks for that, Sihui. We are going to Mr. Kok Song's rallying point, which is at Gush Cloud HQ, and I believe he has arrived at Gush Cloud HQ.
Yeah, Mr. Kok Song and his fiancée Sibyl Lau has just arrived here, and they've entered a room and they're seated down with their supporters, assenters, and also his seconder, Dr. Carol Tan. I believe she's also somewhere in the room. Now he's thanking his supporters and people who are here today with him. Yeah, and he's just speaking to a few of them who were here earlier. And Mr. Ng is all looking good and in good spirits. I believe some of them are also staff of his media team, and he's also here thanking them. And there's a poster of Mr. Kok Song, which one of his supporters have brought in earlier when he came here. Mr. Ng's brother is also seated here in the same room. And Mr. Ng is watching the live telecast of the report as well. Now, as mentioned just now, this is also where Mr. Ng comes with his team to discuss the campaign strategy, as well as draft and amend his various speeches that he has made at the presidential forum, presidential broadcast. Now, the key central ideas of Mr. Kok Song's campaign has been around the idea of he's an independent candidate and that he represents a non-partisan candidate. And he has said that this has become more important than ever for Singapore, and the president must stand above politics.
All right, Rebecca, thank you very much for that. Let's get to Alif Amshar now, who's been tracking Mr. Tan Kin Lian. Alif, there's quite a large crowd gathering outside Tan Kin Lian's residence, we understand. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, large crowds indeed. The energy, the flurry of activity is certainly here. Since the last time we spoke, back then, not much quite going on, but now you can see large crowds gathering in front of Mr. Tan Kin Lian's residence. Mr. Tan Kin Lian is not home. He left earlier at around 8 p.m. To go to a counting station to oversee the proceedings there. He has not returned since. He had earlier said that he would come back before 10 p.m. So we're all just waiting eagerly. You know, every car that passes by here, we're waiting and looking to see if it's Mr. Tan Kin Lian and his team. We're all just gathered here. We understand that Mr. Tan Kin Lian's family and some of his closest election team is waiting inside his house, waiting for the results. But so far, not much action from the volunteers. We don't see much of them, except for one or two who have come here to say that they just want to show support for Mr. Tan Kin Lian today. Really, much of the flurry of activities here, members of the media with the mics, with the cameras, all waiting to catch any glimpse of action of Mr. Tan Kin Lian. And we're hoping to really get a sense of some comments from Mr. Tan Kin Lian on what he has observed while going to the counting stations. When I have those, when Mr. Tan Kin Lian is back, I'll have those updates from the ground.
I will touch base with you then. Thanks, Alif, for that. Well, live now to Geraldine Yap at the Elections Department. Jerry, it's been slightly more than 2 hours since the polls have closed. Bring us up to speed on the vote counting process.
Well, it's pretty much a waiting game here at the Elections Department for the members of the media that have gathered here, at just as much as it is for, the rest of the Singaporeans watching, eagerly waiting for the results. As you've mentioned, it's been about 2 hours since the polls closed, and we're still waiting for the results of the sample count to be out. We're expecting that to come out within this hour. And, so some people might be wondering, why is it taking so long? Because the sample count is not just a matter of, counting 100 votes at each of the 215 counting centres. Those numbers will have to be transmitted back here to the Elections Department, the principal counting centre, and then there will have to be calculations done to account for the different number of voters, a different number of votes at each of the counting centres. So that will take some time. But as I mentioned, we are expecting the sample count results to be out within this hour. But as of now, there's not that much action here at the Elections Department. We've seen some election officials come in. Earlier, we spotted a member of Mr. Tan Kin Lian's team here at the Elections Department, but he didn't stay for long because, he was here to try and get some information, but he didn't manage to get any info. And I've also spotted a member from Mr. Tharman's team also here to get some information, some updates from the Elections Department. So, as of now, it's really a waiting game for us as much as it is for everyone else waiting eagerly to get an early sense of the potential outcome of this presidential election.
Well, thanks for that update, Jerry. But now that people have made their choices, let's take a look at how the votes are counted. Well, once the ballot boxes reach the counting centre, election officials will arrange them according to polling stations. And at this point, candidates and counting agents will be invited to inspect the boxes. They'll be looking for any signs of tampering on the security seal or the box. Who are these counting agents? Well, they are people appointed by candidates or their election agents, and their role is to observe the counting of votes, making sure it's done according to the law. Once the agents are satisfied, the ballot boxes are opened. The ballot papers are poured out, mixed together, and the counting begins. Counting assistants carefully unfold each ballot paper and sort them according to the votes given to respective candidates. And after sorting is done, the ballot papers are grouped into bundles of 100 each. An election official counts these and another will verify the result. And at some point, as vote counting is happening, a sample count will be taken to give some early indication of the result. And this is done by the assistant returning officer. Now, some ballot papers can be rejected. For one, if the votes are given to more than one candidate, or if there is a mark that identifies the voter. And also rejected are ballot papers with no mark, or if the vote is uncertain or unclear, or if the mark is outside the boxes. Now, the same also for papers with no complete official mark of the presiding officer. Now, a recount must be called if the margin between total votes cast for the winning candidate and the rest is equal or less than 2%. If a recount happens, all votes are counted once again. Overseas votes will be counted but will not be material if there is a clear winner based on the local ones. Well, we're off for a short break now, but plenty more to come as we continue our special coverage of the Singapore presidential election.
Well, welcome back to CNA's special coverage of Singapore's presidential election. Polls closed more than 2 hours ago and vote counting is firmly underway. We're waiting for the sample count to be released for an early indication of the possible election outcome. Presidential candidate Mr. Kin Lian arrived at his house just minutes ago. Here's a look.
Then I come back and talk to you later on.
Yes, I can hear.
So, the former CEO of NTUC Income, Mr. Tan, just to give you a bit of backgrounder about his family, he was born to a poor family, eked out living transporting fish from Riau Islands to Singapore. He also grew up in a family of 6 kids, and he lived in rental rooms, and apparently he moved from place to place, and that was all in his blog post.
Well, the issue of one's nationality also appeared during a walkabout by Mr. Tan Kin Lian. According to Mr. Tan, voters want the option of a local-born president and spouse. The other 2 candidates have partners who were not born in Singapore. Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam's wife lived here since she was aged 3, while Mr. Kok Song's fiancée moved to Singapore 18 years ago, and she is now a citizen.
My wife, like me, we are born in Singapore. We are blue-blooded Singaporeans. Of course, we respect other people from other countries who come to Singapore to become citizens. But I think deep down, our locals would prefer at least for a chance to have the President and the First Lady to be true Singaporeans from birth.
Then there was some talk about race, with Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam saying Singapore is ready anytime for a non-Chinese Prime Minister. And that was in response to a question during his town hall at Pasir Panjang Power Station a week ago. Well, he says that race is a factor in politics, but not the only thing that voters look for.
I think Singaporeans today, compared to 40 or 50 years ago, look at other factors. They look at a person's capabilities, they look at their courage, their character, their contributions. They look at people in totality. Race might be always lurking behind people's minds, but it's not the only issue. And that's why I've said before, publicly, Singapore's ready anytime.
Well, a survey last year by CNA and the Institute of Policy Studies showed 7 in 10 Singaporeans are open to a Malay or Indian Prime Minister, responding to the media in 2016. About online chatter saying he was the top choice for PM, Mr. Tharman had ruled himself out, saying he was not the man for the job. All right, let's get back to Professor Eugene Tan. He's in the studio with us to take a deep dive into all of this. Race and nationality, that's something that came up a lot. And as we know, Mr. Tharman did acknowledge that race is a factor in politics everywhere. And he cited the example of Barack Obama during the US presidential election. Who, of course, President Obama had spoken and written about it as well. How far do you think, though, Eugene, will race be a deciding factor in this presidential election tonight?
Dawn, I don't think race will be a deciding factor, but that does not mean that race is not important for some voters. I think all things being equal, if let's say a voter finds that there's nothing to differentiate 2 candidates, race may come in, and I think we have had surveys that show that. But I think with nation building, over the last 50 odd years, we have looked at meritocracy, and multiracialism to be important components of our society. So I would say that race, plays a less important role than it did, a decade ago, 2 decades ago. But I don't think we can ignore it. And in many respects, I think Mr. Tharman recognized that. So if you look at his election symbol of the pineapple, I think it was really a nod to the ethnic Chinese community, and going by how the candidates would at various occasions use the different official languages as well as the national languages to varying degrees. But I think they do recognize that the different races would want to be acknowledged, and so we cannot discount race as a factor. But I would say that it's less and less important.
So Eugene, so let's just say if a non-Chinese should, become a president this round, help our viewers understand, what would that mean for future reserved elections?
Well, I mean, the reserve election, again, by way of background, is a mechanism, that provides for the presidency, to be regularly rotated, among the different races, major races in Singapore. It is what we call a hiatus triggered mechanism, right? So the Constitution provides that if for 5 terms, a particular race has not been represented, in the presidency, the next presidential election, will be for that particular community. So I think it's still a good mechanism to have, right? Because we cannot take for granted, that we will have the different races, regularly represented, at the head of state level, and so the reserve election mechanism, right, kicks in only once after every 30 years. So if you don't have, let's say, a particular race being represented in the presidency for 30 years, that's when the reserve election comes in. So I hope that, we wouldn't have to use the reserve election again. But I think it's useful for it to be there. Because if we look at the presidency as a unifying institution, I think it is important that all the races are regularly represented.
We also saw during the campaign the issue of the nationality of the candidates, significant others, their spouses or their partners being raised. Mr. Tan did raise that as well. He inserted a nativist view perhaps into the campaign. How risky a grasp is it, though, to win votes using a tactic like that, Eugene?
I think it's desperate, in my view, to put it rather bluntly. I think, for me, it was one of the low points, right? Trying to, it ignores the fact that both Mr. Tharman's and Mr. Ng's spouse and partner, respectively, are citizens, right? They have, and not just recent citizens. So if we start to differentiate between citizens, whether you're born here or not born here, whether you've done NS or not done NS, I think, we are going into very, very fine distinctions, right? And the reality is that Singapore continues to be an immigrant society. So I think for Mr. Tan to say that Singaporeans would like to have blue-blooded Singaporeans, to be the president, and as well as the spouse of the president, I think that's not something that would resonate, with Singaporeans. I think, it is a minus point for him. And I think we should be clear, the office, there is no title as the First Lady or the First Gentleman, right? We used to have that, but that designation, that title had been abolished since
All right, Eugene, we'll leave things as that for now. We will pick things up after the break. For now, we are going for a short break, but don't go anywhere just yet. We will be closely tracking the outcome of the presidential poll. And to all of you on Channel 5, thank you for your company. Do check in with us on CNA as we keep out the watch to find out who will be Singapore's next president. And you can, of course, also keep up with the updates on CNA's YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok channels.
The
Welcome back to CNA's Polling Day special. For Singapore's presidential election, we are still waiting on the results to find out who will be the country's next head of state. The three presidential candidates have arrived at their planned gathering points. Mr. Tharman arrived at Taman Jurong Food Centre just slightly past 10 p.m. He was greeted by a wave of supporters.
Now he's making his way to meet his supporters. This is Taman Jurong Hawker Centre.
And Mr. Kok Song also arrived at Gush Cloud headquarters around the same time. He was accompanied by his fiancée, Ms. Sybil Lau.
Lots of drinks and food out there for you. Thanks so much.
My people first, then I come back and talk to you later on.
And Mr. Kin Lian surrounded by reporters as he walked from his car to his front door. He said he would speak to the media later.
Not everyone voted in a polling booth. For the first time in Singapore's history, people are allowed to vote by post from all over the world. More than 3,400 have signed up to do so. After registering with the Elections Department, a voter must print out this ballot paper, accessed only by a SingPass account. And what you see is just a sample. The choice is indicated with an X, the same as how it's done at the polling booth. But what's special is on the printed ballot paper are these special markings on the back. These are to make sure that no one can look inside to tell the vote. This also means that the voter must fold the ballot paper in such a way, following the instructions, to conceal the contents carefully. The voter must also print the return envelope, put in the ballot paper and seal it with glue. On the outside goes their own signature. Well, this is the same signature they should have already submitted to the ELD when registering. The return envelope must be postmarked and dated before today and must arrive in Singapore within 10 days. This means some postal votes might still be on the way back home to Singapore. Well, these machines at the ELD will process the overseas ballot papers when they arrive. The signature on the envelope is automatically matched with that in the database, and any errors are flagged to the assistant returning officer to check. The postal vote and overseas votes that reach the returning officer by 11th of September will be accepted for counting. Right, we are waiting for the Elections Department to release the sample count for the presidential poll. The sample count is taken from a random pool of ballot papers to give an early indication of the possible election outcome. And it's also to prevent speculation and misinformation while counting is underway. Also to serve as a check against the final result. The sample count is carried out when vote counting begins. 100 ballot papers are chosen at random from each polling station in front of the candidates and counting agents if they are present. Now, the votes for each candidate are then counted. They are then added with weightage given to account for the difference in the number of votes cast at each polling station. The sample count will be shown as a percentage of valid votes garnered by each candidate. This normally differs from the actual result by error margins that range between 1% and up to 5%, according to the math behind this. This is the very first presidential poll in which the sample count will be publicly released. The move was taken in the past 2 general elections. In GE 2015, the first sample count was released less than 2 hours after voting closed. But ultimately, the sample count for this poll is just a glimpse into who could be Singapore's next president. If the numbers are too close to call, we'll need to wait for counting to be completed and the returning officer to make the formal announcement.
Well, Eugene, on the issue of the sample counts, which we are waiting to see, they might be coming in at any point. Talk to us about the significance of those percentage numbers and what they will mean to each of these candidates.
The sample counts are critical. I think it gives a candidate, a good sense of where they stand in the race. And I think when you think about the sample counts in the presidential election, of course, this is the first time that we'll get to hear of the sample counts being announced, as part of the presidential election, because it would be across the whole island. So I think the level of accuracy, would be even much higher. So we are looking at 100 ballots from each polling station, and we have 1,200 polling stations. So we're looking at 120,000 ballots. So I would say that whatever proportions that come from these 120,000 ballots, will give us a fairly good indication. So given that the Elections Department have said that, based on their studies and all, you're looking at a margin of 1 to 4%. So it's plus minus 1 to 4%. So it would suggest that, if a candidate, based on a sample count, has a lead in excess of 8%, then I would say that that candidate, has a reasonably good chance, of finishing on top, when all the ballots have been tallied.
When it comes to the accuracy of the sample count, how do you expect it to be different from the presidential election versus a general election?
Well, it will be different, right? Because in a general election, there are local issues, if I could put it that way. Different parties contesting in different constituencies. Not the same parties contest in all, except perhaps for the ruling party. Whereas in a presidential election, right, the sample counts would relate to ballots that apply to all three candidates. And that is where I think we can expect the accuracy to be even higher than in a in a general election. There will of course be variations in different parts of the island, but because they're all weighted, there's a weighted average. So it's something that applies across the whole island in terms of the averages. I think we can reasonably tell, or at least the candidates will have a good sense of where they stand at the race, while the majority of the ballots are still being tallied.
The number that they see, that percentage, is going to be important to all three of these candidates, because all of them have said they want to see a strong showing, a strong mandate from the people and their choice for who should be our next president. What is a magic number, if you could say what would be overwhelming support? Throw me a percentage of what a candidate would be.
Well, I think
less than disappointed.
I think that's a tough one, right? But looking at the fact that this is a three-way race, right, and voters have had ample choice. Very different, in a way, very different candidates with very different backgrounds, with different value propositions. I would say that, for the winning candidate, to poll an absolute majority, right, something in excess of 50%, I think that is actually a very good showing. I would say that anything above 60%, would be an overwhelming victory. But it is possible that the winning candidate, may only get a simple majority, meaning, less than 50%. But I don't think, that's something that will be too much of an issue, right? Because I would say that this has been a keen contest. Three very promising candidates, in terms of what they bring to voters. So I think that's where we'll see how things land.
Yeah, it's certainly something that the candidates will be closely looking for, and also their supporters who've been working all this time, hoping to see that number. The sample counts, again, this is the first year that the Elections Department is going to release those numbers publicly. I mean, that's been important. They have used them in the past in presidential elections, but it's never been released, and that's significant too.
Well, I'm not aware of that, but certainly, here we are looking at the sample counts, for a presidential election being used, at least for the first time, to the best of my knowledge. And so I think that's going to be significant.
No chance, do you think? I mean, if you were to see an overwhelming percentage, that there might be room? I mean, there is a 1 to 5% margin of error when it comes to them, and the Elections Department keeps urging voters to watch for the final outcome. The final result is the result, and they should trust that. But
definitely,
yeah. But it is important not to speculate as well on what the number may be.
Yes, I think but it sort of keeps people expectations within reach, because we will have lots of messages being circulated now as to who's in the lead, what's the gap and all, and so I think the sample counts are important. They help to manage expectations, and I would say that candidates will take whatever they want to take away from those numbers that they will see.
I think it also maybe it isn't an official thing, but perhaps those numbers judge the mood of the country as well.
Hard to say.
Eugene, I have to interrupt you there because it's been about 2 hours, 40 minutes since the polls closed. We are expecting to receive the sample count numbers. Oteli, you've got some numbers for me.
That's right. Thanks, Dawn. Well, the Elections Department has just released the sample count for the presidential poll. Let's take a look. Mr. Kok Song, 16%. Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, 70%. And Mr. Kin Lian, 14%. Now, this is just an early indication that Mr. Tharman may be ahead based on the sample count. But just to remind viewers, it is an early indication. This is the first presidential election that the sample count is being made public. And the aim is to prevent speculation, and misinformation while counting is still underway. A reminder once again that we do have to wait for the returning officer to make the official announcement. Once again, you are looking at the sample count that was just released by the Elections Department. And it does seem that Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam may be ahead based on this sample count.
Right, Eugene, let's get back to you. Look at those numbers. I mean, the sample count number for Mr. Tharman, we're looking at 70%. Your reaction?
It's mind-boggling, if you ask me. This is his polling as well as as good as he did. When he was contesting in the parliamentary general elections in Taman Jurong, where he consistently polled above. Between 70 to 75%, and for him to be able to sustain that across the entire island, I think this is. I mentioned earlier about 60% being overwhelming. But if this continues, when all the votes have been tallied, I think one could aptly say that it is a landslide. But I think it's still early days, right? But if you look at the margins, right, you add up both Mr. Kok Song and Mr. Kin Lian's share of the votes, they're not even half of Mr. Tharman's. So I think, if we could look at the mood in each of the different candidates' gathering point, I think we could get a sense of how the candidates have regarded these numbers. But it's mind-boggling if you were to ask me.
Hold that thought, Eugene. Let's go live now to Tan So-hui, who's been tracking Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. So-hui, what is the reaction at these sample count numbers where you are?
Now, the moment the sample count was announced, the crowd went crazy. They were chanting Majulah Singapura. It was no more online or what. It was a unifying call, and that was the role, and that was the call that Mr. Tharman had always urged people to support him for, and that is this unifying role. Now, he's also consistently talked about being a leader in the new era, and that's because Singapore will be experiencing many challenges, both domestically and internationally. Now, domestically, as Singapore matures into a democracy, there will be more voices and more divisions. He says this is something that will be challenging in the years ahead, and that makes the elected presidency, that role, more important now so than ever before. And also internationally, we're talking about geopolitics, and he says says that he will be bringing his experience, his 22 years of experience in politics as an MP, as a minister, education minister, finance minister, deputy prime minister, as well as senior minister, that entire track record. He will be bringing that knowledge and that experience. Now, we will be looking to speak to him shortly. He will be standing right there in the middle of the crowd. Did you hear that? Majulah Singapura. Now, if elected, he says that he will not change his style. He will not be a different person. He will have the same personality. He will continue interacting with residents as he has been doing so in the last 22 years. Now, he also says that even though the president cannot change policy or shape policy, he will work closely with the 4G leadership. And he will also present a front or a international... People are calling out for him again. And we can see his assenters coming down the escalator as well. Royston Tan, Ho Kwon Ping, that's businessman Ho Kwon Ping, and creative director Royston Tan. Now they are all coming down. Mrs. Mary Liu, and we also see the proposer, Mr. Thomas Chua. He is the chairman of the Singapore Chinese Federation, Chinese Clan Federation. We will be speaking to him shortly. But once the results are out, we will get back to you.
Sir Kwei, as you've mentioned that Mr. Tharman will be giving perhaps a short doorstop. Do we have any indication? Are we talking about minutes or an hour from now?
I think it would be minutes. He will be speaking to us, likely talking about how he feels at the moment, because it is a big margin, 70%, and that's in comparison to 16% and 14% with the other two candidates. So we will likely speak to him. I think there was also a lot of drama in the last campaigning, and people were always questioning his independence of mind, and he's always insisted that he has an independence of mind, and that's something that people know him for. And if the sample count becomes true and it is confirmed as a result, people do trust that he has that independence of mind that he's consistently insisted. So we will be looking to speak to him. It is a wonderful atmosphere here. People are very united, unlike what we saw during the campaign where people were trying to, disunite people and trying to be divisive. But today here we are seeing that Mr. Tharman is acting like a symbol, a unifying symbol for Singapore.
So you're in Jurong West. That is Mr. Tharman's former constituency. I mean, the throng of people around him is quite mind-boggling. But his popularity, it does extend beyond his constituency as well.
I think throughout the campaign, it has extended throughout the rest of Singapore, not just in Jurong GRC, even though this is the kind of turnout that we've seen in Jurong GRC. But during the campaigns, we have seen him walking about to different places, in fact, even to the opposition GRCs like Sengkang GRC, and he was also greeted with a lot of warmth from the Singaporeans. But I think it is clear to see that Singaporeans, whether it's Jurong GRC or whether it's the opposition, those who support the opposition or those who support the ruling People's Action Party, it seems like it does not matter for this election. Now, observers say that this election is very key in terms of having to track the results, because it is a signal as to whether they would do well in the coming general election, and that is expected to be called in 2025. And so all eyes were on this presidential election, and we're really hoping to see the final results.
Also, Si Hui, it's, 9 days of campaigning hard. We saw, how Mr. Tharman, he was using not just social media, he also went through the traditional route, putting up the leaflets. We saw the posters on lampposts. So, I guess to a certain extent, he's managed to sort of reach out to, the masses.
Yeah, that's right. Because he was the only candidate to have had a lot of material to put out, banners, posters. Other candidates were slamming him for the fact that he was putting up all these posters and it was environmentally unfriendly. But he did say that he would put this to good use, he would recycle it. And I think also towards the end, we actually saw a lighter side of it. He said he was a cat person, and they showcased his 3 cats, and I think that was very endearing to Singaporeans. At the moment, it seems that we are expecting him to come down the escalator. Yes, that's what we're seeing. He is expected to come down the escalator and speak with us, the media. Likely to give us an update on what he feels.
All right, thank you, Sir Hui. We will get back to Sir Hui when we can for more on Mr. Tharman's arrival there in Jurong West. Eugene, some said that when Mr. Tharman put himself forward as a presidential candidate, he was a nuclear option who would obliterate the other presidential candidates. Your thoughts on that, based on what we've seen with the sample count?
I think it's a commanding performance. Think about it, Dawn. More than 2/3 of voters voted for Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. This is popularity across, the island. One would say that, he would have pulled votes from across the entire political spectrum. Notwithstanding that this is not, a political contest.
All right, just interrupt you there. Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam is about to speak.
Can we have quiet? Can we have some quiet, please? Quiet. Anting. Quiet. Thank you.
Mr. Tharman, just above my head, yeah?
All right.
Yeah, so she's going to ask us behind.
Right.
How do you feel about sample count results and what does the 70% say about
Right. Well, I'm truly humbled by the strong endorsement that Singaporeans have given to me in the presidential election. I first want to thank my fellow candidates. They put full effort and energy into their campaigns and made it a worthy contest. So I really want to thank them for having contested with full effort, and it has been a worthy contest. I also want to thank Singaporeans for following the issues closely and for engaging calmly throughout this presidential election period. I believe that the vote for me and what I stand for is a vote of confidence in Singapore. I believe that. It's a vote of confidence in Singapore. It's a vote of optimism for a future in which we can progress together and support each other as Singaporeans. That has been my platform, and I believe it has received strong endorsement by Singaporeans. So it's not just about me. It's not about me. This is about Singapore and confidence in Singapore. It will have to be a future where we have deeper respect for each other as Singaporeans. It'll have to be a future that ensures that every generation gets the confidence of knowing that we have reserves and we have the backing that will help us in the future, come what may. It has to be a future in which Singapore is never treated as a small country, just another small country, a future where we are taken seriously in the world, we are a partner of choice, and where we can project our voice of reason internationally in an endangered world. And it has to be a future where we deepen our solidarity as Singaporeans, regardless of our differences, regardless of our backgrounds. We deepen our solidarity as Singaporeans. It is what I've stood for. I believe it is what Singaporeans stand for. And this vote is really a vote of confidence in that future. I'm so happy to have with me my centres, my wonderful team of centres. They're all hidden by the crowd. Mr. Thomas Chua is here, my proposer. Mr. Alami Musa is here. Mr. Lim Seong Guan, Mr. Ho Kon Ping, Mary is here, Sister Mary is here, Vera, everyone else is here. Kim YP, Kamsina. They're all here, and they came onto my team because they too share this vision of the future, a vision of deeper respect for each other, a vision of confidence in Singapore's future. I pledge, and it will be my duty, to use the roles and responsibilities of the President to advance this future of optimism and solidarity among Singaporeans. That is my pledge. And once again, let me just say that I'm truly humble, and I will honor the trust that Singaporeans have placed in me and respect all Singaporeans for the views they've expressed, including those who did not vote for me. So let me stop there, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
How do you feel about the turnout today?
Well, this was organic. People heard on the news that I was going to be conducting the doorstop here, so they came down. I've been a long time in Jurong, and it is an emotional place.
Mr. Tharman, some voters today were told to leave because they wore pineapple-related clothes or carry pineapple-related objects to the voting center.
Right.
What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think it's unfortunate, but the ELD has to maintain its rules. So I felt sorry for them, but I suppose the ELD had to maintain its rules.
Do you have any words to say to your opponents at Rand tonight?
Yes, I just spoke to Mr. Kok Song before I came down. I also tried calling Mr. Kin Lian, but I couldn't get a reply. So I will speak to him later. And I commended Mr. Ng, and I will commend Mr. Kin Lian for their very active participation in this whole process and the perspectives they put forward, as well as just the sheer energy of their campaigns. So I thank and commend both of them.
Mr. Tharman, just now you took a call upstairs. Was that from Mr. Kok Song?
Yes, it was. Yes, and I was trying to get Mr. Kin Lian as well.
So when the final results are in, how will you celebrate? And what will you be?
Well, I'm not having a sudden celebration. I'll be going to a few places tomorrow, again just to thank Singaporeans. But this is the start of a whole period of duty and responsibility. And I really mean it when I say I'm humbled by this vote. It is not just a vote for me, it is a vote for Singapore's future, a future of optimism and solidarity. That's what it really is. My campaign was one of optimism and solidarity, and I believe that's what Singaporeans want.
Mr. Tharman, how are you feeling right now?
Me, I'm over the moon. In our campaign, I met so many people with so much joy, and tonight we see it concentrated here, so much joy. So we hope that this is a period of much more happiness for Singaporeans.
Unfortunately, we don't have tails that we can wag. Well, I think we are progressing with each half decade. This was a contested election with a multiracial slate. I've always said that race is never absent in politics anywhere in the world, or even in an apolitical election of this case. Race is never absent, but it is not the only factor. It is not the only factor. And I think with each half decade, Singapore is changing and evolving. And I hope that my being elected president is seen as another milestone in that process of evolution. Good, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thanks to the media for a very fair treatment of all the candidates, extensive and fair, and putting across all their perspectives. the media played an important role in this maturing as well, in my view. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
We're going for a short break now, but don't go anywhere as we continue the wait for the results of Singapore's presidential election.
Welcome back to CNA's special coverage of the Singapore presidential election. The sample count is out. Presidential candidate Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam appears to be in the lead with 70%. Mr. Kok Song has got 16%. Mr. Tan Kin Lian following closely with 14% of the vote. Just a reminder, a sample count is an early indication of the possible result, but is not final. And we will still need to wait for the official announcement from the returning officer later in the night.
Let's get back to Professor Eugene Tan, who is in the studio with us to talk more about that sample count and also Mr. Tharman's address earlier, his comments and reaction in response to the sample count numbers. Graciousness, humility, clearly on show, the love and adoration for him by his supporters, evident for everybody to see over there. Your response to what you heard him say?
I think it's Mr. Tharman is presidential from the get-go. He thanked his fellow candidates, who contested against him. Talk about how they pushed each other, to offer different perspectives of the presidency to Singaporeans. But I thought what was really significant was how, he spoke about how this was really a vote of confidence for Singapore, right? Because if you look at 70%, and if this continues, right, we're looking at more than 2/3 of voters voted for Mr. Tharman. That would mean that he would have gotten votes from people right across the political spectrum, right? Although this is not a political contest, to be clear. But more significant is really this uniting of Singaporeans, right? People putting aside, their differences, right? But deciding on, who they think, is most suited, for the presidency based on the individual qualities that they bring, their experience, their track record, and what is it, that they offer. But when you look at his remarks, that we just saw, I mean, it was really deep in respect, right, for his fellow candidates, for the people who supported him, and most importantly, for Singaporeans. So I would say that, if this continues and in terms of, it leads to the final result where Mr. Tharman polls more than 2/3 of the popular vote, it promises, a Tharman presidency that I think will be very consequential for Singapore, right? We are going through a leadership change at the political level. We are looking at a more contested, more diverse political landscape. And I would imagine that someone like Mr. Tharman, with his stature, with his international standing, but now, with that solid backing of Singaporeans, that he will be able to, to help Singaporeans, to be very positive, about the future. So I would say that, if we look at the next 6 years, one can imagine that Mr. Tharman would be a very consequential leader in Singapore. Not just domestically, but also internationally.
I just want to touch on Mr. Tan Kin Lian. I mean, again, just to emphasize, based on what the sample count numbers are, he seems to have gotten better from the 2011 presidential election. Back then, he had 4.9%, and now, based on the sample count, he has 14%. Does that mean that he has made some inroads in terms of garnering support?
It would seem like it. So you're looking at almost 3 times more support that he got, compared with 12 years earlier. And I mean, if he maintains this pace, he is not likely to lose his election deposit. But I think what I'm somewhat concerned about, despite running a campaign, that at times, didn't put forth accurately what the president did, with views that, in segments of the population would regard as misogynistic, racist, even nativist, the true blue Singaporeans. I would say that, it's of some concern to me.
Eugene, thank you. Well, Mr. Kok Song has reacted to the sample count number. Let's have a listen. That number is, that soundbite is coming. Here we go.
About investment management, the meaning of non-partisanship. So, in a sense, although my journey to the presidency has ended, but the journey to a more enlightened electorate, especially the younger generation, that journey.
And that was Mr. Kok Song giving an interview after the sample count is out. Eugene, you heard there, what Mr. said. What's your reaction to the results? Rather disappointing?
Well, I think he naturally, he is disappointed. I think we could tell from the way he spoke. But he was gracious. I think he is gracious in defeat. And I thought he made this very good point, that in many ways, his journey, on this presidential campaign, had enlightened Singaporeans, with regard to what the president can do, what are the limits, how important the reserves are. But I think most importantly, that it is important where people who are qualified to run for the presidency, should seriously consider, offering themselves up as candidates, because that would give, Singaporeans the opportunity, of selecting, who they think, is most suitable. So we wouldn't have walkovers, or we wouldn't have an uneven contest in terms of the lack of diversity. So I would say that Mr. Ng is naturally disappointed. I thought he fought a very strong campaign. He's the least known among the candidates. And I would say, yes, he would be disappointed, polling just about 16%, just based on the sample count. So we still don't know the final results yet.
Yeah, probably the least well-known of all three of the candidates coming into this election. Let's get back to that reaction by Mr. Kok Song to the sample count numbers.
I've just received a phone call from Mr. Tharman saying that my team and I had put up a vigorous campaign. And I, in turn, congratulated him on a magnificent victory. When I came forward to stand for the presidency, I said that my number one goal was to ensure that the people of Singapore has redeemed their right to vote in this presidential election. I think I have accomplished that goal because the presidential election did take place today. I also said that Mr. Tharman had mentioned that he would like to have a contest so that when he is elected, he has a mandate from the people of Singapore. I'm delighted for him, and I'm very glad for him that he has indeed earned a mandate from the people of Singapore. So I congratulate him. So this is the moment for me to say thanks, to express my gratitude. First of all, I want to thank the people of Singapore, 400,000 or more of them, for their faith in me and who had voted for me. Second, I want to say thank you to my character referees and also to my assenters who supported me in my nomination. These Singaporeans put their names behind my name and lifted me up from a relative nobody to a somebody. Thirdly, I want to thank my campaign staff, my advisors, my security officers, my young social media warriors, my car drivers, and fourthly, I want to thank my immediate family of my children, their spouses, my grandchildren. And I want to thank my brothers and sisters, led by my fourth brother, Charles, and my nephews and nieces. Fifth, I'd like to thank my two beloved pets, my dog Cotton and my cat, Max, for comforting me and being there for me always. And certainly, I owe the deepest gratitude to my fiancée, Sybil, who sacrificed her private life to walk with me and stand by me. I want to thank, too, my father-in-law, Paul, who, by his quiet presence in all my walkabouts, was also a great source of support and encouragement. When I came forward, I also set as my goal to set an example for good and capable people to come forward and serve our country in the presidency, the government, or the opposition. Another goal was for me to thank my country for what my country has given me. I will continue to serve my country until my last breath. So to the people of Singapore, I wish to say that the relatively low percentage of votes that I obtained was the price that I willingly pay in order to give Singaporeans the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. That was the ultimate objective when I set out to stand for the presidency, and I'm glad that I have achieved that goal. I wish Mr. Tharman every success in the presidency. And I'm confident that he will make a very good president. Thank you. I have decided to concede to Tharman because I do not want to keep all of you from your bedtime. As far as I'm concerned, there is no need to wait a few more hours in order to get the final result. The result is clear. And I want to say thank you once again to the people of Singapore.
Eugene, Mr. Kok Song, the magnanimous in what may well be his defeat in this presidential election. I mean, he said his goal was that there be a contest. There certainly was a contest. What does his candidacy in this election mean, though, for the presidential race to the office?
I think it's hugely significant, right? Someone who could have enjoyed retirement, he's on the verge of getting married, but he decided to put himself forward. And I think he has charmed Singaporeans. The fact that, someone who could enjoy retirement is painting a vision of a presidency, what it would be like if he were to be elected. But I think what many of us would feel for him, was how he is so gracious in defeat. And I think that is such a wonderful manifestation of what the presidential election should be all about. It is not about us against them. It's about Singaporeans coming together, to decide, who among the candidates, would be the preferred person to be the president. And of course, his whole idea of, trying to encourage capable Singaporeans, to step forward, to provide that choice. He talks about exercising the right to vote. Well, I think the right to vote has always been there, but I think what he meant was, the ability for Singaporeans, to go to the polls, to exercise, their democratic choice, to be able to consider the sort of weighty issues, that relate to the presidency. How does it mean, for Singapore's governance and all? And I think, even being gracious in defeat, I think would have won him even more supporters. And I hope that, we wouldn't see the last of Mr. Kok Song, that he will continue to contribute, in other ways.
Yeah, thanking his supporters as well as his dog Cotton and his cat Max as well. That's going to win him some support as well. Thank you, Eugene.
For sure.
We are going to take a short break, but do stay with us as we continue to track the latest developments from the Singapore presidential election when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back to CNA's Polling Day special for Singapore's presidential election. If you are just joining us, the sample count for the poll is out, and it shows that presidential candidate Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam has 70%, Mr. Kok Song 16%, Mr. Tan Kin Lian 14%. Just a reminder, the sample count is an indication of the possible election outcome. We will still need to wait for the official announcement from the returning officer.
Well, presidential candidate Mr. Tan Kin Lian has reacted to the sample count. Let's have a listen.
Good evening. 晚上好. Selamat petang. Malay wanakam. Although this is just based upon the sample count results, I wish to send my sincere congratulations to Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam for his success in being elected, for his success in this contest, and I'm confident he will be elected as the President of Singapore. I wish him all the best in meeting the challenges ahead, and I hope he will be able to help bring a better life for the people.
Mr. Tan, does this mean that you're conceding defeat and you actually performed better than the 2011 presidential polls? Any comments on that, please?
I will concede defeat when the final results are out. But Mr. Tharman has certainly got an overwhelming lead as of now. So I would think that he deserves my congratulations. I expected to do much better, but I think in the election things are uncertain.
Mr. Tan, you were also confident that you could win this election in previous interviews.
Yes.
What do you think went not quite your way this time around?
I would not know. So I think we will have to reflect upon that. Thank you. Okay.
Eugene, Mr. Tan Kin Lian there congratulating Mr. Tharman on his stellar showing in the sample count numbers. He was possibly the most, arguably the most controversial candidate in this race. Your reaction there to what he's had to say?
Well, I think Mr. Tan certainly realizes, the huge gap. Although surprisingly, he's still waiting for, the final outcome. I mean, he did say that he expected, to do much better, and on several occasions, he had said that he's quite confident that the stars were going to be aligned for him this time. But it's still an improvement, over his 2011 performance. If things go on track, he will get to keep his election deposit. And I think, when we look at both Mr. Ng and Mr. Tan, I can imagine why Mr. Ng, as we saw from the earlier clip, being very disappointed, with the result. Because Mr. Tan fought a very abrasive, if I could put it that way, and divisive campaign, with, remarks that I think upset different segments of the population. But yet, being able to poll, in fairly similar numbers based on a sample count, with Mr. Ng, I think, gives I suppose give Mr. Ng, that sense that, well, maybe voters have not given him, that due consideration. But we'll see, what Mr. Tan makes of the final numbers. But this will be his last contest, because he wouldn't, assuming that, he's still well and fit enough, he wouldn't be eligible, in 6 years' time, because the look-back period, for a presidential candidate is 20 years, right? So 20 years would have passed since he last finished his term as NTUC Income's CEO, right? So this is his swan song, but he certainly has left a lot of food for thought, about what is it that Singaporeans would want, or what Singaporeans may not want from a presidential candidate, and certainly from a president.
And which segment of society do you think relate most to Mr. Tan?
I suppose, if I could use the term oppositionists, those who perhaps saw the presidency, as an alternative power center, to the government, which is the People's Action Party. I would say he probably garnered, the most votes from them. I think it would be hard for him to have garnered, the youth vote, maybe votes from women, because of the views. I thought his campaign had very little outreach to young people, including skipping that session with at the Straits Times, with young voters. So I think he targeted certainly at very specific segments within the community, right? And I think certainly he was gaming for those who wanted, the presidency to be an alternative, let's say to the government, to put pressure on the government, to be able to look at issues such as cost of living and all. And so this is something which I think in the end helped him, and certainly the backing from several opposition politicians certainly played to that oppositionist camp as well.
Yeah, one of his messages was to champion the well-being of Singaporeans, after all. Thank you, Eugene. Well, let's get live now to Geraldine Yap. She's at the Elections Department for us. Jerry, the sample count is out. The night isn't over yet, though, is it?
Right. Of course, we've heard about the sample count results. We've also heard from the candidates, but we are still waiting for the final results of the election to be announced, and we are expecting that to come out past midnight. And, that's certainly the case for the last contested presidential election in 2011, when the results came out after midnight, and then there was a recount. But I think in this case, the results that we will get tonight will be final, because, given the commanding lead that the sample count seems to indicate that Mr. Tharman has, we are not expecting to see a recount happen tonight, because a recount will only take place if the margin is 2% or less. So we are expecting the results to come out after midnight, and I think we are also waiting to see what the final voter turnout will be. And the last update was at around 5 p.m. when we heard that about 85% of the registered voters had cast their votes. But we are still waiting to see what the final voter turnout is when the polls closed at 8 p.m. And also, of course, we also have to bear in mind that there are overseas votes that are making their way back to Singapore, either by post or the ballots that were cast at the 10 overseas polling stations. And those votes will only be counted 10 days after polling day. So for the actual final results from both the local and overseas votes, we will have to wait until 11th September at the earliest to find out the final vote counts for each of the candidates.
Oh, thanks for that, Jerry. Showing off cats, giving out pineapples, and even singing. Well, they've been features of this year's election. Well, candidates sure pulled out all the stops to win the hearts and minds of Singaporeans over 9 days of campaigning, whether it's on the streets or online.
This was how Mr. Kok Song kicked off his campaign. Knees and lips on the ground where his old home used to stand. This happened hours just after he was heckled as he gave his 2-minute acceptance address on winning a nomination for the presidential race.
When I spoke, I was booed. That is the meaning of being an underdog. That is why I have come here this afternoon, to show you all where I grew up, and to show you that, yes, life has its challenges, but we must not despair.
Bye, Mr. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks for coming.
Over the next few days, he would establish his presence on the ground in person without posters and banners.
Hang them up for a few days, take them down, and then send them to be destroyed as waste. We should try to be as environmentally friendly as possible.
Good morning. Say hello to the people of Singapore.
But it was social media that became the biggest part of Mr. Ng's campaign. He's since amassed over 100,000 followers, becoming the most followed candidate on Instagram and TikTok. Social media, too, played a big part in Mr. Tan Kin Lian's campaign, with informal posts like these jam sessions, live streams and lunchtime selfies characterizing his social media pages.
Okay, next. What is your weirdest food combination that you like?
Nasi lemak together with chai tau kueh. What's my name?
Mr. Tan also had a variety of on-the-ground strategies. Almost all walkabouts were at public spaces such as hawker centres, then going door to door. At one point, all media doorstops were cancelled and plans for an online rally scrapped. And the last day of the campaigning, it was all hands on deck for volunteers to distribute thousands of flyers. Then Mr. Tan came out to make his final address to the media.
This is a micro replica of my campaign posters that you see on the roadside and in the public places. I believe that the people who receive this will keep this. And if I get elected, it will be more valuable.
It wasn't only posters and banners for Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. His election symbol became a staple at his events, whether if it's in its physical form or on posters or shirts. It's even made waves online, a plus for the candidate who was once the only elected MP without a presence on Instagram. His online pages showed a more personal side to him.
I happen to have a head that reflects light quite well. And when I sit in Parliament, with all the lights, it often forms an interesting pattern on my head. This one just happens to be the crescent with 5 stars.
Still, for Mr. Tharman, it's the more conventional routes of outreach that mattered most. His posters and banners can be also seen across the island. He's the only candidate who hosted a hybrid town hall with a physical audience of more than 600 people.
I'm going to be doing what I've always done. As I've said, I'm not going to change my personality because I've been at this for more than 20 years. I enjoy meeting people. I enjoy interacting with them.
Eugene, Mr. Tharman, a seasoned campaigner, that also would have played a part in the sample count vote that we've seen tonight.
Oh, definitely. I think, when you look at, until this presidential campaign, Mr. Tharman having, very little social media presence. Even though he was on Facebook, he didn't post very often, but during the campaign, I think he realized that he had to ramp up for a variety of reasons, whether that's to have more visibility or whether to put across, his campaign messaging. But I wouldn't say ultimately, that his lead, as demonstrated in the sample count, can be attributed to one particular form of campaigning. I think, he had said before, that it is about what he's done over the years. That you don't win an election, in just the 9 days of campaigning, between nomination day and cooling off day. So I think it's all that combination. But he certainly, relied on his political instincts, right? So if we look at Mr. Kok Song, who who, because of environmental reasons, opted not to have posters and banners, one could wonder whether that did affect him to some extent, because there was little visibility on the streets of Singapore, as to whether Mr. Ng was contesting or not, and particularly when he's the least well-known among the three candidates. I think a more fiscal, in-person sort of presence through posters and banners, could have made a difference. And of course, one data point that you could take away from Mr. Ng's campaign, of course, is that, despite his high numbers on the different social media platforms, that's no indication that it would translate, to votes. Whereas Mr. Tharman, with perhaps not the most promising of numbers, had that significant lead, that we saw earlier. So I wonder, I suppose it's a combination of walking the ground. He's a known entity, and of course, his close quarter style of campaigning. That handshake, that pat on the back, that chat, that banter. Getting the energy going at wherever places he had the walkabout. So something I think for politicians to look at the campaigning, right? Because there's been so much talk about social media campaigning and all. I think the social media campaigning is here to stay, but I think we cannot ignore the importance of walking the ground.
It's interesting to note how the various campaign styles have paid off. Well, let's listen in now to how presidential candidate Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam reacted to the sample count.
Right.
How do you feel about the sample count results, and what does the 70% say about
Right. Well, I'm truly humbled by the strong endorsement that Singaporeans have given to me in the presidential election. I first want to thank my fellow candidates. They put full effort and energy into their campaigns and made it a worthy contest. So I really want to thank them for having contested with full effort, and it has been a worthy contest. I also want to thank Singaporeans for following the issues closely and for engaging calmly throughout this presidential election period. I believe that the vote for me and what I stand for is a vote of confidence in Singapore. I believe that. It's a vote of confidence in Singapore. It's a vote of optimism for a future in which we can progress together and support each other as Singaporeans. That has been my platform, and I believe it has received strong endorsement by Singaporeans. So it's not just about me. It's not about me. This is about Singapore and confidence in Singapore. It will have to be a future where we have deeper respect for each other as Singaporeans. It'll have to be a future that ensures that every generation gets the confidence of knowing that we have reserves and we have the backing that will help us in the future, come what may. It has to be a future in which Singapore is never treated as a small country, just another small country. A future where we are taken seriously in the world, we are a partner of choice, and where we can project our voice of reason internationally in an endangered world. And it has to be a future where we deepen our solidarity as Singaporeans, regardless of our differences, regardless of our backgrounds. We deepen our solidarity as Singaporeans. It is what I've stood for. I believe it is what Singaporeans stand for. And this vote is really a vote of confidence in that future. I'm so happy to have with me my centers, my wonderful team of centers. They're all hidden by the crowd. Mr. Thomas Chua is here, my proposer. Mr. Alami Musa is here. Mr. Lim Seong Guan, Mr. Ho Kon Ping, Mary is here, Sister Mary is here, Vera, everyone else is here. Kim Waiti, Kamsina. They're all here, and they came onto my team because they too share this vision of the future, a vision of deeper respect for each other, a vision of confidence in Singapore's future. I pledge and it will be my duty to use the roles and responsibilities of the President to advance this future of optimism and solidarity among Singaporeans. That is my pledge. And once again, let me just say that I'm truly humble, and I will honor the trust that Singaporeans have placed in me and respect all Singaporeans for the views they've expressed, including those who did not vote for me. So let me stop there, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
How do you feel about the turnout today?
Well, this was organic. People heard on the news that I was going to be conducting the doorstop here, so they came down. I've been a long time in Jurong, and it is an emotional place.
Mr. Tharman, some voters today were told to leave because they wore pineapple-related clothes or carrot pineapple-related objects to the voting center.
Right.
What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think it's unfortunate, but the ELD has to maintain its rules. So I felt sorry for them, but I suppose the ELD had to maintain its rules.
Do you have any words to say to your opponents and friends tonight?
Yes, I just spoke to Mr. Kok Song before I came down. I also tried calling Mr. Kin Lian, but I couldn't get a reply. So I will speak to him later. And I commended Mr. Ng, and I will commend Mr. Kin Lian for their very active participation in this whole process and the perspectives they put forward, as well as just the sheer energy of their campaigns. So I thank and commend both of them.
Mr. Tharman, just now you took a call upstairs. Was that from Mr. Kok Song?
Yes, it was. Yes, and I was trying to get Mr. Kin Lian as well.
So when the final results are in, how will you celebrate? And what will you be
Well, I'm not having a sudden celebration. I'll be going to a few places tomorrow, again just to thank Singaporeans. But this is the start of a whole period of duty and responsibility. And I really mean it when I say I'm humbled by this vote. It is not just a vote for me, it is a vote for Singapore's future, a future of optimism and solidarity. That's what it really is. My campaign was one of optimism and solidarity, and I believe that's what Singaporeans want.
Mr. Tharman, how are you feeling right now?
Me, I'm over the moon. In our campaign, I met so many people with so much joy, and tonight we see it concentrated here. So much joy. So we hope that this is a period of much more happiness for Singaporeans.
Unfortunately, we don't have tails that we can wag. Well, I think we are progressing with each half decade. This was a contested election with a multiracial slate. I've always said that race is never absent in politics anywhere in the world, or even in an apolitical election of this case. Race is never absent, but it is not the only factor. It is not the only factor. And I think with each half decade, Singapore is changing and evolving. And I hope that my being elected president is seen as another milestone in that process of evolution. Good, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thanks to the media for a very fair treatment of all the candidates, extensive and fair, and putting across all their perspectives. The media played an important role in this maturing as well, in my view. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
Presidential candidate Kok Song has conceded the election contest after a sample count by the Elections Department gave opponent Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam the lead with 70% of the votes.
The two spoke on the phone after the results, and Mr. Ng congratulated Mr. Tharman on what he described as a magnificent victory, while Mr. Ng went on to thank his supporters and family.
I said that my number one goal was to ensure that the people of Singapore has redeemed their right to vote in this presidential election. I think I have accomplished that goal because the presidential election did take place today. I also said that Mr. Tharman had mentioned that he would like to have a contest so that when he is elected, he has a mandate from the people of Singapore. I'm delighted for him, and I'm very glad for him that he has indeed earned a mandate from the people of Singapore. So I congratulate him.
He said that the results didn't prove that Singaporeans rejected the principle of non-partisanship.
I think the seed has been sown. The word non-partisanship will now enter the vocabulary of governance in Singapore. And my hope is that this presidential election, when I stood on the principle of non-partisanship, will grow over time. And that, I think, will contribute to the further maturing of the political process in Singapore.
Well, he also thanked his team for supporting him throughout the campaign.
One chief of staff, which was civil, 3 advisors, 4 senior executives. But we were supported by an amazing group of young people here from Gush Cloud. They were the people who inspired me.
Mr. Tan Kin Lian also congratulated Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. The sample count indicates that Mr. Tan has secured 14% of the vote, and that is higher than the 4.91% that he drew during his 2011 bid for the presidency, during which he lost his election deposit.
Although this is just based upon the sample count results, I wish to send my sincere congratulations to Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam for his success in being elected, for his success in this contest, and I'm confident he will be elected as the President of Singapore. I wish him all the best in meeting the challenges ahead, and I hope he will be able to help bring a better life for the people.
Presidential candidate Tan Kin Lian says he will only concede the election when all the votes have been counted and final results are announced. Mr. Tan added that things are uncertain in an election and he will need to reflect on why he didn't perform better. Well, according to the sample count, he received 14% of votes. And speaking to media, he thanked his supporters and family.
I will now heed the advice of my family to take life easy and live a normal life. I will spend more time with my grandchildren. In my free time, I will continue to do my part in voicing the hardship and aspirations of the people through other channels.
And here's a recap of the sample count. Presidential candidate Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam in the lead with 70%. Mr. Kok Song, 16%. Mr. Tan Kin Lian, 14%.
We're going for a break now. World Tonight is coming up next, bringing you the key stories from across the globe. But not to worry, we will be rejoining you all soon enough, bringing you the announcement of the presidential election results when it happens. So lots to look forward to here on CNA. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Good evening, I'm Keith Liu. Tonight's top stories. Vote counting still underway for Singapore's presidential election, but a sample count shows a commanding lead for former Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam. The imminent arrival of Super Typhoon Saola brings parts of southern China to a standstill. Flights cancelled, schools and businesses closed, and even casinos forced to shut. Thailand's jailed former Premier Thaksin Shinawatra has his prison sentence cut from 8 years to 1 by the king. The state journal citing his contributions to the country and loyalty to the monarchy. Well, we're still waiting final results of Singapore's presidential election, but a sample count shows that presidential candidate Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam has 70% of the votes. Mr. Kok Song, 16%, and Mr. Kin Lian, 14%. Mr. Tharman says he pledges to honour the trust that Singaporeans place in him, including those who did not vote for him. He says he will use his role to advance the future of optimism and solidarity of Singaporeans.
I believe that the vote for me and what I stand for is a vote of confidence in Singapore. I believe that. It's a vote of confidence in Singapore. It's a vote of optimism for a future in which we can progress together and support each other as Singaporeans. That has been my platform, and I believe it has received strong endorsement by Singaporeans. So it's not just about me. It's not about me. This is about Singapore and confidence in Singapore. It will have to be a future where we have deeper respect for each other as Singaporeans. It'll have to be a future that ensures that every generation gets the confidence of knowing that we have reserves and we have the backing that will help us in the future, come what may. It has to be a future in which Singapore is never treated as a small country, just another small country, a future where we are taken seriously in the world, we are a partner of choice, and where we can project our voice of reason internationally in an endangered world. And it has to be a future where we deepen our solidarity as Singaporeans, regardless of our differences, regardless of our backgrounds. We deepen our solidarity as Singaporeans. It is what I've stood for. I believe it is what Singaporeans stand for. And this vote is really a vote of confidence in that future.
Presidential candidate Kin Lian says he will only concede the election when all the votes have been counted and final results are announced. Mr. Tan says things are uncertain in an election and he will need to reflect on why he didn't perform better. According to the sample count, he received 14% of votes.
I will now heed the advice of my family to take life easy and live a normal life. I will spend more time with my grandchildren. In my free time, I will continue to do my part in voicing the hardship and aspirations of the people through other channels.
Presidential candidate Kok Song has conceded the election contest. Speaking on the phone, Mr. Congratulated Mr. Tharman on what he described as a magnificent victory. Mr. Went on to thank his supporters and family.
I said that my number one goal was to ensure that the people of Singapore has redeemed their right to vote in this presidential election. I think I have accomplished that goal because the presidential election did take place today. I also said that Mr. Tharman had mentioned that he would like to have a contest so that when he is elected, he has a mandate from the people of Singapore. I'm delighted for him, and I'm very glad for him that he has indeed earned a mandate from the people of Singapore. So I congratulate him. I think the seed has been sown. The word non-partisanship will now enter the vocabulary of governance in Singapore. And my hope is that this presidential election, when I stood on the principle of non-partisanship, will grow over time. And that, I think, will contribute to the further maturing of the political process in Singapore. One chief of staff, which was civil, 3 advisors, 4 senior executives. But we were supported by an amazing group of young people here from Gush Cloud. They were the people who inspired me.
Friday's election marks Singapore's first contested presidential race in more than a decade. Some 2.7 million Singaporeans were eligible to vote. Sabrina Ng brings us more on what happened earlier today.
Scenes like these were played out all across the country this morning. Some voters began queuing at 7:30 a.m. before polling stations opened. For first-time voters, it was an exciting time.
Being able to be politically involved and playing your part as a citizen in terms of choosing wisely and choosing who you want as your leader to represent your nation on a global scale is something that I do take pride in.
Singapore's leaders were spotted at the polling stations. President Halimah Yacob and her husband were among the first to cast their ballots at Chung Cheng High School Main. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and his wife were also early, casting their ballots at Crescent Girls' School. Some used the election department's website to check the queue status at their polling stations before heading down. There were also priority queues for seniors and those with special needs. Voters registered electronically, proceeded to collect their ballot papers, then cast their vote.
The process is quite fast. The moment you went in, just like a smooth flow, you can straight away go to the balloting queue and just do your vote and then just submit it in.
But about half an hour after the polls opened, queues started to build up at some stations. Some had technical issues with the e-registration system. At around 10 this morning, ELD said queues had improved at most polling stations and told voters to head to the polls throughout the day.
Very fast because afternoon nobody. Voters will talk morning and the time, but afternoon better.
By noon, slightly more than half of all eligible voters had finished voting. The 3 men contesting for the presidency also cast their votes. Mr. Kin Lian was the first of the 3, voting at Anderson Serangoon Junior College.
It was very smooth, so I think I must have waited maybe just 2 minutes. So it's very. Of course, I was in the priority queue.
Mr. Kok Song voted at Katong Community Centre.
Very nice today. Bright and breezy. Had a good night's sleep. So thank you for all coming. I'll go in and vote now.
Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam voted in the evening at Raffles Girls Primary School.
I'm feeling fine. It feels good. Just the calmness of Singapore feels good.
And for the first time, more than 4,000 Singaporeans voted at special polling stations set up in nursing homes.
For bedbound residents who otherwise have problems getting out of the home, now they are given the opportunity to vote.
By 3 p.m., about 2 million Singaporeans, or 74% of eligible voters, had made their choice. Queues had eased at most places by then. At 5 p.m., just 3 hours to the close of voting, around 85% had voted. And finally, at 8 p.m., after the last ballots were cast, the doors to polling stations around Singapore were shut. And the wait begins as ballots are counted.
Now, many Singaporeans in mainland China and Hong Kong had to wrestle rough weather and logistical challenges to get their votes in for the presidential election. CNA's Olivia Seong reports from Beijing.
I'm going to cast my vote for the next presidential election by post.
33-year-old Christy Liu has been living in China's Yangjiang for about a year. With no polling station where she is and the nearest one 3 hours away in Hong Kong, she quickly registered to send in her ballot by post, but little did she expect to run into numerous obstacles. That sent Ms. Liu on a 21-kilometer drive the next day, although new challenges emerged. Ms. Liu said the post office staff told her they were unfamiliar with how to handle the return envelope, and in the end, she had to pay about $3 Singapore for registered mail to get her ballot sent back.
More than happy to pay because I wanted the vote to be counted for sure. But I thought the whole process maybe could be better because I'm not sure about other countries, but probably mainly in China. Language is also a barrier.
Some other voters in China also told CNA of similar experiences, while others said they simply dropped their vote in the mailbox. A few raised concerns over whether their vote would reach Singapore and before September 11, the stipulated deadline. Singapore's elections department said those who downloaded their ballots would be considered as having tried to vote, and their names will not be removed from the registers of electors even if their ballot is not received. Those whose ballots have been received will be informed via email after the counting of overseas votes is complete. On hindsight, 45-year-old Jason Lim says he wished he had opted for the postal ballot. The Singaporean who lives in Guangzhou had taken a day off work, intending to go to nearby Hong Kong to cast his vote. But these plans were swept aside as a super typhoon hurled towards China's south. The high-speed rail train that Mr. Lim was booked on to Hong Kong cancelled as a result.
I was so disappointed, and I was thinking, is there any other way I can do? I tried to. I even thought of flying back to Singapore to vote, but you know I suppose because of the typhoon, even airplane is unable to fly.
The Singapore Consulate General announced on Friday morning that voting would proceed in the city, even though the third highest typhoon warning was issued in the early hours of Friday. It added that registered voters who decide not to cast their ballot for safety reasons can reach out to the Elections Department to restore their names to the registers of electors. Over at the Singapore Embassy in Beijing, voters told CNA that the process was quick and smooth.
I'm actually working in Tianjin, so I thought it's important for us to come in person, like, to physically put a vote in.
My second time actually, and I think it's important because we have a voice even though we're not in Singapore.
More than 6,600 Singaporeans registered as overseas voters for this year's presidential election. About a quarter, or 1,600, live in mainland China, Taiwan and Hong Kong. Now, at the close of voting, the ballot box will then be sealed and immediately sent back to Singapore, where on arrival, it will be stored at the Supreme Court until counting is done. Olivia Seong, CNA, Beijing.
Singaporeans in Tokyo also braved the elements to cast their ballot. The Japanese capital is experiencing a heat wave and is one of 10 overseas polling stations for this election. Michio Ishida has more.
Desmond Teo and his wife Angie Chan were so determined to vote this time round. Despite their busy schedules, they decided to work in a cafe near the Singapore Embassy so they can quickly cast their ballots. It's their second time casting their ballots in Tokyo.
We understand the importance of electing our president, so I think this is just us doing our part, right, for our country. Yeah, even though we are away from Singapore.
Polling takes place at a time Tokyo continues to experience a heat wave, hitting close to 35 degrees Celsius. It's the hottest summer ever for the Japanese capital since temperatures were recorded from 1898. Under this heat.
Yeah, it's really hot today.
How are you coping under this heat wave?
Well, we have been staying at home a lot with air conditioning.
While many were happy to vote and fulfill their duty as Singaporeans, but they complained it was just too hot.
I try to go to the office earlier in the day and leave later in the evening, so I'm not out in the sun as much. Yeah.
as you can see, I'm sweating all the time. Yeah, it's like a lot of people tell me like, oh, you're from Singapore, you should be used to the heat, but actually it's not true. We are not as hot there as it is here.
This is the worst summer I ever experienced in Japan.
As much as it was important to meet the setup required by the election department in Singapore, embassy staff prepared to accommodate electorates considering the heat wave risk.
What we have done is the polling station is located within the embassy, which is air-conditioned, and there's lots of shade in the vicinity. We've also standby bottles of water for members of the public who may need it, and our embassy staff are on hand to assist any voters who may feel discomfort, especially due to the heat.
The number of Singaporeans in Japan has remained stable over the past 3 years. As of December 2022, 3,036 Singaporeans resided in Japan, according to the Japanese government statistics. About half of them live in Tokyo. So there are quite a few who have had to travel for this election. And there are those I contacted who could not vote. They were unable to be in Singapore for 30 days during the past 3 years, primarily due to COVID-19 traveling restrictions. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
Still to come, China rolls out measures to encourage people to buy property. But uncertainty at stressed developer Country Garden could undermine confidence. Plus, Malaysia unveils a $20 billion plan to revitalize its manufacturing sector over the next 7 years. Right, we're tracking the 2023 Singapore presidential election here at CNA. It's been close to 5 hours since polls closed. Let's go now to my colleagues in the CNA studio for the latest.
Thanks very much, Keith. The returning officer is set to announce the outcome of the presidential election. We are expecting him to deliver those results soon, the final outcome of which candidate has won the race for the presidency to become Singapore's 9th head of state. Now, a reminder to our viewers, if you're just joining us, that earlier this evening, the sample count released by the Elections Department of Singapore, it showed Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam with 70% share of those sample counts. Former GIC Chief Investment Officer Mr. Kok Song second with 16% of valid votes, followed by former NTUC Income Chief Mr. Kin Lian with 14%. Now, the sample counts, they were first publicly released by the ELD at the 2015 general election. They are done at the start of the counting process. This is the first presidential election where we are seeing those sample counts released. At those counts, well, a counting assistant at each counting place picks a random bundle of 100 ballot papers. They count those ballots in front of counting officials, in front of candidates, even if they happen to be present. Those votes, they're added up with weightage given to the number of votes that are cast for each of those polling stations. In this occasion, 1,264 of them. Well, after those sample counts were released earlier this evening, the candidates did give us some reaction. Speaking to the media after the sample count was announced, Mr. Tharman was first. He said he was truly humbled by the numbers and by the strong endorsement of Singaporeans. He thanked his supporters, volunteers who've beaten the ground with him over the 9 days of campaigning. He also thanked Singaporeans for their confidence in him and also for those Singaporeans who did not vote for him. He expressed his thanks to them as well. He said that the sample count numbers were a vote of optimism for him and for the country. And if he were to be elected as president, it would give him the opportunity to deepen solidarity in the nation. You are looking at live pictures there at the Elections Department, where the returning officer, Mr. Tan Meng Dui, is expected to arrive at any moment now with the final result of Singapore's presidential election for 2023, the first time that Singaporeans have been able to vote in a presidential election in over a decade. So once again, if you're just joining us, there's Mr. Tan Meng Dui. Let's listen in.
Result for the presidential election 2023. Mr. Kok Song, 390,041 votes. Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, 1,746,427 votes. Mr. Kin Lian, 344,292 votes. Total votes cast for the candidates, 2,480,760. Rejected votes, 50,152. The votes cast in Singapore, which have been counted, are conclusive of the result. I declare Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam as the candidate duly elected as the President of Singapore.
Well, there you've heard it. The returning officer has confirmed that Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam will be Singapore's 9th president after securing 70.4% of the votes. Well, Mr. Kok Song came in second with 15.72% of the votes. And as for Mr. Kin Lian, he got 13.88% of the votes. Well, total valid votes, 2,480,760. And the number of rejected votes, 50,152. And more than 2.7 million people were eligible to vote in this presidential election. And there we have it. The voters have spoken and they have delivered a resounding victory to Mr. Tharman. Mr. Tharman will be Singapore's 9th president. So Eugene, must be Mr. Tharman, his team, they must be, celebrating. What a triumphant victory. But where do you think all the, opposition, where have they gone, the supporters?
Oteli, I think it is a victory for Singapore, not just in the way that Mr. Tharman had put it earlier, but it's a victory for Singapore because I think we are seeing that sophisticated voter, voters that were prepared to keep in mind, the prior affiliations, but also take into account the candidates' experience and ability, their track record, whether they would have the moral, in their assessment, right, whether they were the moral backbone, to be able to get a job done. But the question of, what happened to the opposition voters, I think, again, it reflected the Singapore voters, right? They saw this as a presidential election, not as a general election. They were not prepared to treat it as a proxy general election, neither treat it as a referendum on the government of the day. I think they do recognize the role that the presidency plays, and that it would be, in a way, harmful to their own interests and to the Singapore, if they were to look at the presidency as a political prize, that should go to, one political party or the other. So I certainly take the view that, we are seeing the sophisticated voter in action today, and collectively, they have delivered, that victory for Singapore. But I think if we look at, Mr. Kin Lian, who was certainly, the flag bearer, right, for the oppositionist camp, I think it also suggested, that voters were not going to listen to the opposition leaders' endorsement, right, although in a personal capacity, right, that Dr. Tan Cheng Bock, Dr. Chee Soon Juan, Dr. Paul Tumbaya, Mr. Kenneth Jeyaretnam, Mr. Lim Tien, Mr. Goh Meng Seng, that despite the support and endorsement that they gave to Mr. Tan Kin Lian, voters were going to decide for themselves, notwithstanding if they were opposition-leaning or not. But I think it also reflected, Mr. Tharman's own qualities, that perhaps he is seen as someone who straddles, the political divide, if I can put it that way.
Right, Eugene, we do, in fact, have a statement from the Prime Minister, from Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong on the presidential election. He's had this to say: Singaporeans have chosen Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam to be our next president by a decisive margin. As head of state, he will represent us at home and abroad and exercise custodial powers, including over the reserves and key appointments. I thank the three candidates for putting themselves forward in this presidential election. I'm happy that Singaporeans have been able to exercise the right to vote for our next president and to focus on what the elected president is about. In this election, both voters and candidates have shown a greater understanding of the roles and duties of the president, which bodes well for Singapore. He goes on to say that Mr. Tharman has a long and distinguished record of public service, and he has every confidence that Mr. Tharman will carry out his duties as president with distinction. Mr. Lee says he's called Mr. Tharman to congratulate him already on his election and to assure him of his government's full cooperation. Mr. Tharman, he says, has also declared his intention to work closely with the government. The statement goes on to say that as head of state, the president has to be a unifying figure that all Singaporeans can look up to and to identify with. He must exercise his custodial powers under the Constitution wisely, bringing to bear his experience and independent judgment internationally, representing Singapore. He must fly our flag high. PM Lee says he thanks the election officials for their hard work as well, and that has ensured a smooth and successful presidential election. And he finally goes on to say he wishes to thank all the voters, both here and those overseas too, for doing their civic duty. And finally, he ends the statement by saying, now that the election is over, let us come together again as Singaporeans to tackle the challenges ahead and build a stronger and more united nation. And the statement ends there.
So let's talk about, Mr. Tharman, his role as chief diplomat. So basically, over the next 6 years, he's going to be representing Singapore on the world stage. And we talked about, this geopolitical, situation and tension that's happening. How valuable will his appointment be?
Telly, with this significant victory, certainly world leaders will recognize, Mr. Tharman as a leader that commands the trust and confidence of the majority of Singaporeans. He's not just a leader with a small victory margin, but Mr. Tharman also brings with him, his own personal qualities, right? So his involvement in many international councils, whether you're talking about the IMF, relating to matters such as economic and finance, to the Human Development Index published by the United Nations. He is a known entity abroad as well. His views are well regarded. His views are sought after. So one could imagine that now, flying the flag as Singapore's head of state, when he visits other countries, when he represents Singapore at global meetings, the voice of Singapore will be prominently aired. And that's important, right? We began this show where I mentioned about the important role of the head of state for a small country like Singapore, which is so dependent on being open to the world. And it is important, for Singapore to continue to be relevant. And I think our leaders need to project that, be able to show how Singapore is relevant to the world. And with Mr. Tharman as the chief diplomat, with his stature, with his standing domestically and internationally, I think, we will be in a very good situation, even despite, the world, the geopolitical tensions, getting higher and higher. But it is what our leaders need to do, right? And the president, has to take the lead in flying the Singapore flag high, as Prime Minister Lee mentioned.
Eugene, prior to today, Mr. Tharman was the man who said, "I never planned to be a president." He also said that a lot of his career was down to luck. It wasn't down necessarily to planning, but there was a lot more than luck that contributed to his overwhelming win today.
Well, it is his track record, right? It is his being a known entity to Singaporeans. It is him, despite being, in the ruling party, being able to articulate views that sometimes may not be entirely aligned, with the ruling party. And if you look back at his term, as finance minister, and I know that a bit better because I was then a nominated member of parliament. So I sat through 3 budgets that Mr. Tharman put before the nation. And we could see that left of centre shift, the move towards stronger social safety nets, trying to have higher regard for low-paying jobs and all, trying to uplift those communities. And so I think it is all this set of policies, that Mr. Tharman advocated, in a quiet way, that I think has helped to shift, Singapore's policies, towards towards a more equitable sharing of Singapore's wealth. So it is not just pure luck, where Mr. Tharman is concerned. I think there's a lot of hard work. There's also that vision, that purpose of what he thinks people in politics should do. That is not just about personal glory, but about making that visible difference. And I think the results show that Singaporeans recognize, his contributions, over, the past 20 years. I suppose, he is one of those few, PAP politicians. I mean, of course, he's now a former PAP politician, right? And a former politician, who was able to straddle the political divide, and so have support from across the political spectrum.
So would you say, with this win, it's basically cemented his reputation as Singapore's most popular politician?
I think, it'd be hard to deny him that particular accolade. I mean, think about it, right? 70% across the entire nation. More than 2 out of 3 voters voted for him. And the way he ran the campaign, very dignified, and sometimes, it seemed as though he was a little laid back, right? Because his other candidates were putting forth, visions of the presidency, that seemed to move beyond the status quo. So I would say, yes, that he is, his popularity has been cemented. But of course, voters will now see, Singaporeans will be looking forward to what he brings to the presidency. Will he transform, the presidency, while keeping it, within the constitutional confines of what the president can do?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be viewed as well in light of the fact that Mr. Tharman's prominence as a politician is very recent. He's now a former politician, but only by just over a month. That too may have given him quite the advantage. I mean, one gets a sense, perhaps looking at these numbers, many voters may have already made their decision well before the 9 days of campaigning.
Well, I agree with you, Dawn. I mean, if let's say, he had retired from politics for 5 years, then his currency may not have been there, but he was leveraging, on the fact that he was a well-known politician, a well-liked politician, a well-regarded politician. And so, that sort of transition, very quick transition, I think, did aided him, even though, it may have raised doubts in the way that Mr. Kok Song raised, right? Can you change your loyalty so quickly, from being a PAP minister to being the independent president? But I think, that there was that trust, that he would be able to make that transition. And I think, again, right, voters went on his track record, the independence-mindedness, that he has always brought about, to his job, to his many roles. And of course, his very early days, as a student activist, when you're studying in London, in the UK. So I think it is a very significant day for Singapore. I mean, think about it, right? The first non-Chinese presidential candidate, to win a contested election, where there's a contest, but when I mean by contested. And I think that's significant. I don't think it means that we can do away with the reserve presidency, because it was really about Mr. Tharman. I mean, if I could put a term, right, it was really the Tharman factor. Right? It's about him, his qualities, his track record, and that dignified campaign, that he brought, which I think captured, the imagination of Singaporeans, that it is possible, right, for the presidency to be that unifying office. Not that there was any grave doubt, but he showed, by the force of personal example, that this can be done, and that even as politics become more contested, there can be the presidency that will still unite Singaporeans.
Yeah. And also, Mr. Tharman, he got onto social media. He was quite late in the game. He was like just, I think under a year when he got in. And it feels like, we got to see a very personal side through all the candidates. Mr. Tharman as well, his wife was involved, his pets were involved as well. So is this going to be the trend, the future trend that, any of the candidates that want to campaign, they have to show that personal, that light-hearted side?
Yes, Otelli, I think so, right? I think social media is here to stay. And I think Singaporeans want increasingly, to see their politicians not to take themselves too seriously, but they also want to know politicians for who they are, right? The personal side of them, because, we are not just voting someone to be a leader, right? Whether the head of government or your MP or head of state, because the person comes as a complete package. And so I would say that social media is here to stay, but I think Mr. Tharman demonstrated, right, the need to walk the ground, the need to have that good sense, that good feel of the ground, to have, an accurate pulse of Singaporeans, and to be able to respond to what is it that they're yearning for. I think his slogan says it all, respect for all, and I think that's something that hopefully in the years ahead, the Tharman presidency would be able to advocate, and uplift society, in a way that brings everybody, that raises everybody up. And I think that's will be fantastic for Singapore.
Eugene, we have the numbers for the rejected number of votes in this presidential election, and it stands at around 50,000 of those votes rejected. That figure is higher than what we saw in 2011 at just under 30,000, I believe it was, rejected votes in that presidential election. What do you think that says of how voters cast their ballots?
Yeah, I think in my view, I don't think it's too significant an increase, but it would appear, that there were voters, who felt that despite the three candidates, there wasn't one, that met their requirements. We don't know what that could be. It could turn on a variety of factors, ranging from whether, there was concern about their prior affiliations, or whether, like in the case of Mr. Kin Lian, the sort of association with the opposition, whether race could have played a part, But I think I wouldn't be too bothered. by what seemed to be a slightly larger absolute number of spoiled votes, because I think voters in the end, are entitled to that. If they feel that none of them meets the requirements, that they have set for a president, I suppose, for some of them, spoiling their votes, would be the way that they would see it. So it would suggest that they're not willing to give their vote to just one candidate. And so they're not giving their votes to anyone at all.
And Mr. Tan Kin Lian, he had 13.88% of the vote. Earlier, in his speech, he said he was expecting to do better, but I guess at least he will get to keep his deposit, $40,500 this time round compared to 2011.
Yes, he definitely did, right? By a whisker in a way, right? You need 12.5% of the popular vote, or 1/8 of the total votes, to keep your election deposit. But I think here's the repudiation, if I could be so direct, of Mr. Tan Kin Lian. Notwithstanding the fact that he did improve his vote count by 3 times, does suggest that voters recognize what the role of the presidency. I think we still have room to improve our understanding of the presidency, but I think it's also about that for someone who intends to occupy the head of state position, that how they conduct themselves, their views, is something that voters are going to look at very, very seriously. So whether it has to do with his pretty girls pose, his blue-blooded Singaporeans, and at times, seeking to overreach what the president can actually do. I think all that, may have come back. But it also, given that he secured, close to 14% of the popular vote, it does suggest that, we do have this solid body of voters, who might perhaps prefer, the presidency, to be seen as a political prize, that should be captured by a party that doesn't form the government. But I think it is clear that voters, would want, a president, with a track record, and views, that resonate with Singaporeans, that is respectful of the differences within Singapore, and one that treats with respect, the different people, women, young people, immigrants, naturalized citizens, and all.
Eugene, where several opposition parties openly, at least members of those opposition parties, openly backed certain candidates, the 2 biggest ones, the ruling party, the People's Action Party, the Workers' Party as well, they were very careful not to endorse any candidate. They were very disciplined about that and have been very, they haven't said anything specific. But how do you think that Mr. Tharman's win here will sit with the ruling party now going forward, especially in light of Singapore's sort of future vision for itself?
I would say that, Mr. Tharman will certainly be an independent president, right? I mean, he has a good, an excellent sense of how the PAP government works, and I don't think, he's going to get in the way. But I think, he will certainly want to be able to influence the government, right? I mean, if you had a president with 70% of the popular vote, he does have that mandate, vis-a-vis the government. If we recall at the 2020 general election, the PAP polled nationally about 60 to 61%. So here we have a president that one could say, is more popular. But it is not about bragging rights. I think, we now would have a situation where, the president would be able to have that very solid, strong working relationship, right? One grounded on mutual respect, trust and confidence, And given that, we are in the midst of a leadership renewal and succession, I think having, a well-regarded statesman, right, in the Istana would be an added boost, to the government. That I think, regardless of the results of the next general election, one can say that, there is still this bastion of stability in the presidency.
But they would be going into that election without who we perceive to be one of, if not their most popular politicians.
Oh, I've said before, when Mr. Tharman announced, that he was going to run for the presidency, that it is a significant loss for the People's Action Party, right? Because he is someone that people regarded as, that the party, has still that potential, that promise, represented by Mr. Tharman. So they I think will acutely feel his loss, and the question now is whether, they would be able to replace someone like him, or the party as a whole shift towards, that sort of position that Mr. Tharman has taken throughout his political career. And I think Mr. Tharman has set the standards. I think he has set the way. It's now the question of whether, the ruling party sees that, that's something that he could learn from Mr. Tharman.
All right, thanks for that, Eugene. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has congratulated Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam on being elected as Singapore's next president. And here is the statement once again. Singaporeans have chosen Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam to be our next president by a decisive margin. And as head of state, he will represent us at home and abroad and exercise custodial powers, including over the reserves and key appointments.
PM Lee continued to say he thanks the three candidates for putting themselves forward in this presidential election. He's happy that Singaporeans have been able to exercise the right to vote for our next president and to focus on what the elected president is about. In this election, both voters and candidates have shown a greater understanding of the roles and duties of the president, which bodes well for Singapore.
Well, he added that Mr. Tharman has a long and distinguished record of public service, and he has every confidence that Mr. Tharman will carry out his duties as president with distinction.
PM Lee continues by saying that he's called Mr. Tharman to congratulate him on his election and to assure him that his government's full cooperation. Mr. Tharman has also declared his intention to work closely with the government. Now, as head of state, the president has to be a unifying figure that all Singaporeans can look up to and identify with. PM Lee says that he must exercise his custodial powers under the Constitution wisely, bringing to bear his experience and independent judgment.
Internationally representing Singapore, he must fly our flag high.
And once again, the results of the Singapore presidential election are out. Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam with 70.40%. Mr. Kok Song, 15.72%. And Mr. Kin Lian with 13.88% of the vote. Thank you for your company through the night as we tracked the outcome of the presidential poll.
And also a big thank you to Eugene for joining us this evening. We are going back to World Tonight, and here is a look at the day's developments.
I declare Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam as the candidate duly elected as the President of Singapore.